Good afternoon. We're going to go ahead and get started with our work session today. We have quite a bit of important items. Of course, we always have important items, but today we've primarily dedicated this work session to talk about the educational planning work that's been underway for quite some time. And in a moment, I'm just going to turn things over to Dr. Boone, and we'll follow the sequence from there. But I just want to remind the board that what we're discussing today ties to our school board accountability plan. It also continues to tie to the goals we've established and reaffirmed many times in terms of our effort of truly being the cornerstone of a proudly diverse community. I know several of you have had the opportunity to attend some of the community forums that have taken place as part of the educational planning work. I want to make sure we take as much time as we need to hear the presentation, have a good discussion, ask questions, and we will gauge where we are at the end in terms of what we would like to do next. But as of right now, just as a reminder, our plan is to have this meeting today, and then we will not have our business meeting on the 15th. Our business meeting has been pushed to the end of the month, and then we'll come back with a work session in December. So with that, I'm going to turn things over to Dr. Boone, and we will proceed accordingly.
Thank you, Mr. Jordan, members of the board, ladies and gentlemen. We have been working and waiting for this. We have been working toward this report and looking forward to presenting it to the board and working very hard in terms of how do we meet the goals and expectations, as the board has said, of being a proudly diverse school district, navigating the challenges of declining enrollment and yet program needs for the 21st century learning environment to be reflected in what our portfolio of school options look like. You know, we approach this work looking at a number of things. One, and you'll hear today about how we address our, as I said, our real estate given declining enrollment and program needs. Two, what do we know about our facility conditions? And three, how do we match and address the school board's expectations around its mission and vision and goals for the school district in a way that we're navigating a lot of different things. This is always a very challenging subject, but I want to, on the front end of this, give appreciation to Tracy Richter of Cooperative Strategies, Lee, and all members of the team. Want to give appreciation to Dr. Bailey, Sir Dennis Footy, and all, Khalil LeGrand, and all who have supported the work that we've been doing as a district leadership team, as well as the members of the Educational Planning Task Force. As we get into the presentation, you will see that the work isn't done with this presentation to the board. This is a first step, and there's going to be more conversations within the administration, with the task force and others. And so I just conclude my remarks before calling Tracy up with the fact that everything here is a recommendation to the board. We will certainly share the assumptions that we'll use to develop these recommendations, but nothing is a done deal until the board takes its action. So I want the public and everybody to be clear as to where that goes. So with that, I'd like to ask, okay, so Dennis is opening up for us? Okay.
Thank you, Dr. Boone, Mr. Jordan, the school board. We'll have three presentations. I'll take a minute and talk a little bit about enrollment, and then I will turn it over to Tracy, who will probably be the majority of the time, and then he'll turn it over to Mr. Mike Ross from HBA Associates and talk about the facilities. Well, I guess I need to turn this thing on, don't I? You have in your packet, it's on, Sharon. Okay. Just step through it because I only have a few slides. A couple points here on enrollment counts. I want to talk a little bit about responsible and serving school in the report, and I will be updating you on more detailed school enrollment reports next week with your first monthly enrollment report. You will see in responsible versus serving school. We report SOL information by responsible school, while there are a few serving schools such as Rosemont, those data roll back to the responsible schools. So places like Rosemont is a serving school and not a responsible school. The other point I want to mention on this slide is the data that I work with and the district works with is attending enrollment. That is, the students actually show up in particular buildings. What cooperative strategies work with is what they call live-in enrollment. Well, that is where the students live. So you'll see in his facilities material, you'll see enrollment information, and he'll point out that that is where the students live. So you have the timeline there of the actual major enrollment reports that we do. Go ahead, Sherman. These are some factors that certainly impact school enrollment. They may not be totally inclusive, but notice that we have a number of things that are outside of the district's control that may impact enrollment and vary over time. Tracy has talked briefly in the past about the birth rate and how as the birth rate declines, eventually a couple of years later, we will see a declining enrollment as those smaller cohorts of students roll up into kindergarten. In the last slide. Here is the 5-year enrollment trends. Notice that we continue to lose enrollment. This year's enrollment is down about over 500 students from last year. So we are seeing a declining enrollment, and that's expected to continue into the future. Next week's report will have the actual state reported enrollment. I just got that information this morning. So do you have any questions before I turn it over to Tracy?
If I may just make the comment, again, we wanted to give the board the most current information around enrollment as we think about the entire educational planning piece.
Ms. Basine?
I just have 2 questions. At some point in the future, could we get an idea of the numbers in terms of out-of-district transfers? And I know we do that.
Yes.
We get that at times, not specialty programs, but also the number or percentage of students that attend private schools as well?
I don't know how we can get that information, but we'll look to see if we can't try to get that
Okay.
information.
There was a data point in some report that showed the percentage of students in the city that Norfolk Public Schools serves.
Yeah.
Right.
So it's, you know.
It's
how
out
to-
there.
yeah.
I think I've seen it in the State of the Region report before, but I think as in context of this dialogue.
If you go into, if you try to dive deep into the numbers, the live-in, and then how many are actually attending, and then you kind of tease out, I mean, you could do the math, private, and then you'd have to group homeschool.
Right.
And with
we
it,
do
homeschool is a
homeschool, but
very,
that
very
would-
small percentage, but
But Norfolk used to have a higher percentage of homeschooled children than the national average at one point. I remember it was reported a couple of years ago, but anyway,
Cooperative
that's-
Strategies does annually provide what they call live-in attend matrix
Right.
by every school. We have yet, hopefully in the next couple of weeks, we'll send them the student file so that they'll ungeocode it and be able to provide us 2017 fall data.
Okay.
Ms. Doyle?
So we have asked the question about the percent of students eligible to come to Norfolk Public Schools, and we say that over time, it's been roughly 82%. Do we have that hard data point in any presentation today?
Not today. That's
what I'm
that's
getting
what Ms. Basine is asking for. And as we do the expanded report on overall enrollment, we will tap into that. Tracy Richter did include it in a report we did earlier this year to the board. But we
And I
will
think
bring
that's
that back
important
up.
that we keep that data point out there, because that's an important point for people to remember, that the declining enrollment doesn't mean that we're educating a percentage less. We're educating the percent same. It's just a different number.
Right.
Right.
So I think that's an important distinction. Also, military deployments, we keep saying that they come and they go. Do we actually have the figures? So from
That was-
1990 to 2000 to 10 and to 20, what we have seen come and go so that we know the difference in the delta?
I don't know if we done it with the come and go, but you will recall, we did share with the board earlier this year, or maybe the latter part of last year, what years those major carrier groups left the city. And so those were roughly, I want to say through 2011 or so on up. And we can pull that information back out that we provided to the board.
Yeah, I think that's another important data point. We talk about it, but I'd really like to be in black and white so that people know that, again, that's an external factor out of our control that
Right.
contributed to the declining enrollment. And if there's any other data point related to the economy, other than just the economy, then I think that's important to show. I don't know if Tracy has a recommendation of what that data point might be.
In terms of the economy,
Yeah, so the external factors, one listed is economy. So how does that impact enrollment?
okay.
Oh, I'm sorry, Ray Wood.
Yes. So the decline in the population has been pretty consistent over the last 5 years. Do you expect, based on what you see, that decline will continue right on for until?
Because what, the main driver this year has been a declining elementary enrollment due to a much smaller kindergarten class 2 years ago. So like second grade this year is down by 250 children because of the 200 and some fewer kindergarten students that showed up 2 years ago. So as those smaller classes come up through the grades, then enrollment will continue to decline unless there are external factors that would bring more kids back into the district. Kindergarten was a little bit lower than projected this year, as well as pre-K. So we're seeing that, and Tracy's talked about that in previous presentations, about that birth rate is going down.
But was pre-K lower because we could only offer fewer slots, or?
No.
So,
I
Just-
mean, I don't want to get off on a tangent
well, I was
here,
going to say, you know,
so-
I sat through the presentation that they did at Southside STEM, and I think Mr. Richter is going to go through a lot of that information. And so if we take what we've gotten from Mr. Footy combined with what I think Mr. Richter is going to present, we'll get plenty of time to get an overview and ask those questions.
Okay. Well, thank you. Tracy?
Thank you, Dennis. Dr. Boone, members of the board. Thanks for having me again. This is, can I answer a couple questions? Because I have it right in front of me.
Sure, we appreciate it.
Let me go to your 5 to 18 census data, obviously estimated, because 2010 was our last estimate. 5 to 18-year-olds, again, you can only make an assumption of 5 to 18-year-olds. The city estimated about 39,480 kids of that age, people of that age. That 2021 estimate, we always do a 5-year estimate for you and a block group projection, is only expected to increase 200 kids at that age range. So I don't know if we can expect continued decline or steady, depends on those birth rates. Keep in mind that our birth rates have declined nearly, well, if I go back to 2007, which is a peak, you were above 4,000 births that are linked to mother's address. You are closer to 3,500 births today. So, I mean, obviously the market share, for lack of a better term, is down. And I think what we're expecting to see is a level of birth rates across the country. I don't think we're going to see those echo booms for a while. I think we live in a society that has become more conservative in their approach. So I think that what we can probably count on is at least a steady demographic now. Now, whether we attract more students is probably more on, it'll probably get to more of choice or, program offerings or performance of schools. So I think that gives you some background on that enrollment stuff. It's in our background report that we provided for the task force too, and that's online for you too if you want to see it, and I can direct you toward that. But those are a couple of things that are factoring into what we have. as we shared in the community meetings that we've had, that our live-in projection is stabilizing. We still see some decline, but it's not that sharp decline we've seen of the 1,200 in that 5-year period. But we're still going to see some decline because we're not out of that. Those low grades that are filling in the high grades. We can't get rid of that 10-year projection because of that second grade class that Dennis referred to, and those are going to carry out for the next 10 years. And so to push those out of our 10-year projection is too hard. Unless we see that leveling off. I was actually a little surprised. I know that could be a rabbit hole in that pre-K question, but I was surprised that with the slots out there that we had, that we didn't get the pre-K enrollment. I think that's a part of what we see in that decline. And I know that's near and dear to your heart, Dr. Gabriel. I know that pre-K is a mission, as it should be for everybody. But I think that's your baseline to start. And when we see the official numbers come in, I know that Lee is chomping at the bit to get the official data today, to get this geocoded so we can get your live attend analysis to you, so you can start to see that transfer in rates. So we can really, because we'll update the live-in projection also to make sure that we're, and I think that Dennis's projection came in really close this year. I think ours is pretty close to his too, on the live-in versus attend. So at least now, I mean, after almost 5 years of doing this, what we can count on is that the data that we're being presented in projections and seeing out there is pretty reliable. And so I think that from where we were, 4 years ago when we walked in the door, trying to just get our handle on this stuff and trying to figure out, okay, where's it going to go? I think we have a better grasp today than we ever have. And so I think that's good news. And as we just continue to get good data, it's only going to get better. And so, and that's up to you how long you use me or that. And that's certainly not up to me. So that's a good start on that and a good transformation into this. Do you want me to move this or be good? Okay. So what I'm going to take you through tonight is kind of the process of where we are and where we're going. I'm going to give you 2 preliminary recommendations tonight, and the reason I'm going to give you 2 is because I think there's 2 out there that I would normally give you a recommendation on, but I don't think I'm quite ready to do that yet, based on advice of the task force, the committee that we're working with, and just finishing up some community effort. But I'm going to take you through those options about what we're trying to narrow down to get you a recommendation sooner than later. All of these have an impact on budget and how we're going to look at next year, and so we need to come to conclusion on these fairly quickly for the 18-19 year, and then give you some ideas about what our plan of attack is for the spring, to make sure that we're giving you a more inclusive look by next fall about what this division will look like in the next 10, 15, or 20 years. And so that's our goal there. So I'm going to take you through that. Obviously in the process, we go through a lot of data collection. School condition that Mr. Ross is going to take you through tonight, I think you're going to find it fascinating. I don't think you're going to find it surprising. I mean, I think that as you look at the condition of facilities and not just the physical condition, but the programmatic condition, what's great about this, but we've looked at capacity and adequacy. We're looking at curriculum academics is that despite facilities sometimes, you're making the turnaround. You got more accredited schools than you've ever had. I mean, it's just turning around, sometimes despite the facility standing in our way. And so what we need to do is we need to, as I've been presenting out in the community, is that we need to keep building the ask for building a good strategic, both curriculum program along with a funded facilities plan. And they got to run hand in hand. And I think sometimes it takes the confidence of the programs and the academics and the curriculum to make sure then we can start highlighting the schools and the condition of schools. And so I think this is going to be a big part of it. As our enrollment and demographics stabilizes some, we still have questions out there. What's going to happen in the St. Paul's Corridor? What's going to happen as the city kind of still transitions some? What's going to happen in housing movements and as we look at displacement of lower income housing in the city and how they're going to disperse that. There's a lot of questions out there, but the good news again is that there's an open door between us and the city planning department. Lee has met several times. Dennis has set up with us, and Dr. Boone has forged a pathway for us to now, when we come in, we can set up meetings and we can just say, hey, let's come and talk. And they're forthcoming with information, not that they always haven't been, because they always have been, but now it's a kind of a regular conversation. And so even though we're not in front of it yet, there's a lot of decisions out there based on some decisions that the city's going to have, that they're going to be making pretty soon. Our community engagement is, we've conducted a kind of a new and refreshed steering committee. We've met 3 times, and we've kind of walked through some data. We've struggled at times, and we've made progress at times. And I think a part of it is, kind of getting to know the data, kind of getting to know me, kind of getting to know all that stuff has to come together. We've been out to 3 community meetings. Unfortunately, the first one wasn't very well attended, and we know that. However, with a lot of kind of pushing forward, the second one we had a really nice crowd at. I mean, a lot of community members too, not just staff members, and so I was really pleased to see that. And then on Saturday morning, we got about 25 people out on a Saturday morning when, Norfolk State's having their homecoming, and there's all kinds of stuff going on in the city. We have 25 people show up to spend 2 hours with us on Saturday morning, so I was very pleased with that. I'd like to see them get bigger, and they will get bigger as we go forward. And we're going to continue to engage the community, and part of the process, and when we get to next steps, I'm going to talk about our next steps as we get to the more local level, based on some of these recommendations. So our planning objectives, we hold these to be true all the way through this process, is that we want school utilization to be optimized across the board. Not only on a total seat concept, but we want balance of enrollment. We want to make sure that we're optimizing our facilities to maximize our programs, to maximize the dollars that we spend in facilities. But part of that utilization has to come with goals of balancing the diversity of schools, the socioeconomic of schools to the best extent that we can. And of course, that's not always the easy balance because we don't have all the influences in our hand. And so we have to, in planning, as we all know, we all have to react to decisions that are out of our hand. But we continue to do that through our planning objectives, and some of the recommendations you see tonight are going to continue to help meet those. The other thing as a planning objective for this year is those high school attendance zones. With the addition of the comprehensive CTE, this is going to be a major decision point and will influence quite a bit over the next 5 to 10 years in this division. And so this decision, and the reason you're not going to see a recommendation tonight is because I want to take you kind of through the breadth of what the possibilities are for the boundary, because I think they all have different impacts to them. So let me get into the preliminary recommendations that we'll first make. That Camp Allen and Stools Point. Now this is a boundary change with the building of Camp Allen and the size of that building. And part of the agreement with the DOD is that, which reminds me, let me back up a minute because I want to answer your military question too. Can I pause here a second to answer that? Because in our background report, we have been able now to start geocoding based on billet those students, and so we may be able to track that better for you now. It was difficult at first because billet information is very confidential, but we have representation on our steering committee from the Naval base, so that's really good for us. And we're starting to collect that data on a more accurate level year by year. So hopefully we can get a good number to you on kind of what our trend is. So at least we can show you student rates and how we're generating student rates out of the military. And maybe that'll be a good baseline of information. I didn't want to forget that. And that's kind of directly related to this too. So,
Right. Thank you.
Yeah. So basically what's happening is that we need to balance the enrollment at these buildings. As you look out and you look at the projected enrollment, on this map you're going to see that just south of Terminal and to the east of Hampton is a gridded out area. And the goal is to balance enrollment by doing a boundary change in this area that you see that's gridded out. The numbers pretty much show what they show in that with the recommended capacity at each building, trying to balance those enrollments over time, because if you can see the enrolled projection for Sewell's Point is going to far exceed the capacity of the building. However, we want to do this in a manner that is not disruptive, not as disruptive as it can be, and we want to make sure that that families can make decisions together as we go forward with this. And so the next page shows kind of our recommendation of progression of the transition. So what we'd like to do is we'd like to start that entering pre-K and kindergarten to move into the area as we move into next year. So we're not really disrupting. Now, the other thing we're going to recommend with this is a sibling consideration. Now, I think it's more of a board level policy decision about how to do the sibling. That in this case, allowing the kindergartner to stay may only subject them to a long-term change anyway. let's say they're entering kindergarten as a third grade brother or sister, and then they leave, do we keep that kindergartner in there? Well, that's only going to prolong the capacity issue that we have at Sewell's Point. So if I were to make the recommendation, I would make the sibling recommendation to be, if the entering kindergartner has an older sibling, that they go with them instead of staying at the building, in this case because of the capacity. We don't want to overutilize Sewell's Point in time. Again, that would be your decision, but from this perspective on a capacity and utilization, it may be wise to hold that side of the equation to do that. And again, we don't want to disrupt families. We know that there's some military presence in this, and so we already know that we want to stabilize. It's an unstable kind of environment that those kids have to go through in billet transfers and all that, and we know that. So we want to stabilize as much as we can. And that's why we think we can do this. And we can actually balance enrollment fairly quickly in about 2 or 3 years by doing this, because we're going to take out that entering kindergarten. And again, we look at it year by year. But the anticipated balance we can get to by 2019-20, even probably, and that's probably a good year to target. So 2 or 3 years out, I think we can balance the enrollment by making this boundary change.
And if I can add that that's about the time the new building would be opening.
Yep.
And so it's consistent with the commitment when I talked with the board about the percentage of military connected children that we had seen a decline in that building, and so we needed to get to a threshold that allowed the federal government then to make the commitment for the new building. The board would recall that we did discuss that, and you know, we've also talked about programmatically how both schools are high-performing schools and strong, so it's not a matter of perception of having to leave something great and not going to something great. So.
Can I just ask a clarifying question? Can you just walk through the numbers, Tracy?
Yeah, it's difficult sometimes to read those as you go through. So what we're trying to do is show you the grade level numbers that we project out in time, and you know how many students would be impacted at each grade level. Okay, and so for instance, if you go across, what we're trying to get to at in the projected count of grade advancement, you can see that we can see that the projected enrollment, like in Sewell's Point, if we go out to 1920, for instance, at 622, and we see the grade level number, that's how many students then we can transfer to the other school to get the number down. And so by 2019-20, you see that there's approximately 69, or there's 71 students, I guess is the number, 71 students that would come out of that 622. And so what it shows us then is that means 71 less at Sewell's Point and 71 more at Camp Allen. So it increases that enrollment. So they work hand in hand together. Mm-hmm. And so then you can see as we grade level progress out to 21, 22, that I get, kindergarten or pre-K all the way through 4th grade, and then in 22, 23 get all the grades. And so the estimated at the end, the estimated transfer would be about 134 that come out of Sewell's Point and go into Camp Allen. And so that's how that grade level progression works. Now, once again, we may get a cohort that will mess us up. Again, if we happen to get a small class comes in for some reason, who knows? But those are just estimates that we can see. But even in that, we know that both of these schools then will be at a good utilization number, will be above 80% at both buildings, even if we're off a few students here and there by grade level. So I think we're going to be fine. But does that make sense how those grades then progress in and out of buildings? So as we just move forward, so you see that's what we try to do is that pre-K and K, then the pre-K through 1, pre-K through 2 over the years. And that's why we did that. And again, if we have to shift that back or forth, we know the numbers to be able to do that. But the end goal is to really, it's going to be somewhere, again, I would estimate it's going to be somewhere between 130 and 150 students that transfer across in time, yes.
All right, so let's just take the first block that says existing counts, grade advancement to Camp Allen. P4 is pre-K 4?
It is.
Okay, and the 64 number represents 64 students that are currently at Camp Allen.
That's correct.
The 8 at Sewell's Point represents current
Correct.
pre-K students at Sewell's Point.
Yep.
If we go over to 2017, 2018, there's no change. For the
So
pre-K
we
students?
assumed 100% cohort survival across,
Okay,
okay?
And that's this current year, 17,
Yeah.
18 is the current year.
is the current year, right. So then if we go back to that first block, let's just take, first grade, for example, one. There's 57 currently at Camp Allen. There's 21 students at Sewell's Point in first grade.
Yep,
That
Okay,
would be
that would be
impacted by
im-
this
Yeah.
boundary
By the
change.
boundary change. So so this 21, does that represent 21 students that would,
yep, come out and go to the other building. We're assuming just a straight 100% cohort survival. So it could be, like I said, some years it may be 95%, other years it may be 105%. We just stabilized it.
and you're saying that this 21 comes from the grid
Yep.
that was on that map
Yes, yes.
beforehand?
Yes.
And,
And let me clarify something. It's a 2016-17 because we don't have the official enrollment for this year. So when Dennis gives us the updated data, we will send you an updated chart of this to make sure that our numbers, and like I said, I still think we're going to be about the same number, but this shows you from that 16 what we anticipated.
okay.
Yeah.
So let's go back to the sibling concept that you just described a little bit earlier.
Okay.
And let's just take the first graders that are coming out of Sewell's Point Elementary, the 21. Walk me through a scenario where one of them has a sibling.
Okay.
What happens?
So if we have, let's say, a kindergartner that's entering, and they have a,
Who lives in the grid
who lives in the grid,
and who is going to go to Camp Allen?
that's correct.
Okay,
So we would, you have two choices you can make here, or the third, which is both. The first choice was a typical choice that says that if you have a sibling, then the kindergartner stays, okay, because they can stay with their third grader, which then is as clean as it can be, but we may run into capacity issues if we get too much sibling.
at Sewell's Point,
Correct.
yes, okay.
So, the other thing to do is that if you enter the kindergartner, then allow the older sibling to come over.
Okay,
And we have plenty of room at Camp Allen to do that,
okay,
so that would be fine. But if they if they choose both, then it would be difficult to offer transportation to those who chose to stay as an older sibling. It's just an expensive proposition for a 4-year transition. So what we're trying to do is we're trying to ease the transition as much as we can. But at some point, meeting us halfway as a parent, and maybe, and again, this is a tough decision for a parent. They may want to see their second or third grader finish at the building, or they may just say, you know what? I want my kids together at the same school. It's a brand-new building. I've got my neighborhood kids that are going anyway. And we may get the whole neighborhood saying, hey, as third graders, we're just going to go. We're just going to go with our neighbor. So, and I think that's a good problem to have. The quicker we can balance the enrollment, the better, because I think we're going to hit Sewell's Point's capacity pretty quickly on this. So, that being said, that's why I make that recommendation, is that to allow a kindergartner to stay. When that older sibling leaves, they're going to be a boundary that none of their neighbors, none of their, in that area go to. And so I think it'd be a more difficult transition for those children in the long run.
okay,
Even though at first, I think the initial reaction from parents would be the opposite, until they got to that point and then realized, hey, wait a minute, none of my neighbors are going to the same school because they started.
in the area where the grid is, the students would have to be bused,
Yes. Yeah.
where it's proximity to Camp Allen?
Yeah.
That's correct.
Okay.
And
that
they're bused now,
clarifies.
and I'm almost 100% sure they're bused now.
Okay.
With the exception of parents who take their kids
Okay.
to school.
Okay.
Yeah, we
Right.
have railroad, we have a number of street and geographical barriers, so transportation.
Safety zones.
Thank you.
Okay, yes.
Dr. Robinson.
Question and a comment. I guess the question is going to be for us. What if an older child at Sewell's Point, parents want to send them to Camp Allen just because it's a new school? They live in that new zone. Would be a question that, would they be allowed to do that? I think that some parents are going to want to say brand-new school.
Well, and this is where we get to our choice piece, that for elementary students, there's not a specialty program being stood up at Camp Allen, so that's not one of the criteria. The other criteria deal with childcare and other options, that we currently have in our elementary choice options. And so you know, if a parent wanted to go to the new school, then, and they are outside of the defined boundary that's approved by the board, then they would have to fit into one of the other
I'm asking
choice
if they were
criteria.
inside the defined boundary, in the transition zone. Say, because we're starting off moving the younger children, the-
Right.
Oh, okay, you're
So-
saying.
So
yeah.
that a fourth grader or a third grader that lives in the new zone, the transition zone, their parents say, well, we don't want to wait, we want to go ahead and move our child
Go.
over.
That would be fine.
And the comment that I have is that my understanding is that one of the reasons why the military was interested in revamping the Camp Allen School is because they want to increase Navy personnel that lives in that housing district, so that gives them a better school to go to. So, and I think, especially as the word gets out that Camp Allen is a high-performing school as well as a brand-new school, I think it's going to draw more students too.
And again, this is the reason that my recommendation to you would be to make the sibling consideration that way, because I think what you're gonna find is that. I think you're gonna find,
Build it, and they'll come.
yeah,
And I think, again, that this proposition becomes a win-win for students at both schools. essentially. You know,
Yeah.
all of us have had time probably to read at Sewell's Point or do activities or just visit the school, and you see how tight they are.
yes.
So does this still say portables are going to exist at Sewell's Point?
This can take away the portables then,
Okay.
yeah, as
So
we
that would
transition
remove all
out.
portables.
Should remove all portables.
Over time.
Yeah, over time.
exactly.
Absolutely. We'll have plenty of capacity between the two buildings.
And then the differential of the 134, if you look at existing count grade advancements to Sewell's Point, 16, 17, the number 600, and when you get to 22, 23, it's 466, that's where you get the 134?
Yes, yeah,
Okay.
yep.
But
So-
the differential, adding to Camp Allen, it's 156 adds.
Correct. So here's what we'll do, because I think this is a chart that we've been using to look at transition. When we update these numbers, what we're gonna do is we'll probably make a linear chart like this. I think it'll be easier to understand, because then we can show you that progression by year.
Okay.
And it'll be easier, and we'll just make it on one chart instead of two separate ones.
Okay.
I think it'll be easier to understand for that. I know this isn't, but this is a little hard to follow I think, without good explanation. But yes, you're following the math exactly right.
And
That's-
so the 80% building utilization takes into account the new Camp Allen capacity and the current Sewell's Point without portables.
That's correct. It's permanent capacity. Yes.
Win-win.
I think so.
Yeah, this is a good move. This one is, we believe. Okay. Now, the next one, the recommendation I'm going to make is, and it's just one slide for it because I want to show you what it means, is that we're going to make a recommendation that may be tied or may not be tied to a decision you make on the high school boundary with a comprehensive CTE choice. We're making the recommendation that St. Helena actually do a feeder pattern change that goes into, that will go into the Blair Middle School and the Maury High School pathway. With the transition of, and what we'll talk about at Lake Taylor, but also in an effort to look at balanced integration and diversity and even transportation, that, you know, and we get this a lot in the steering committee, we talk about that, and this has been mentioned several times, and it comes from the committee about, you know, kind of the river being a barrier to come across into the city and to help diversify out of the south of the city. And this is one positive way to do that, that we see that there's capacity, the transportation actually, instead of going all the way over to Lake Taylor, but staying on more of the west side of the division, and the programmatic pathways are there. I don't think we're gonna abandon this idea, and we're gonna get back to this, about kind of our neighborhood choice concept too. We wanna make sure that we're holding true to that. But we believe in this pathway, and you can see that in a 5 high school boundary. Now, this can change. This chart on the right means a lot. And again, there's a lot of numbers in here, but what I want to take you to is this idea about kind of that live-in count, and this is the difference. This is the live-in versus the attend. The live-in counts show you that the utilization of facilities in the Maury High School pathway, you can see, really do become, with the exception of elementary school, which we can't do anything about in the feeder necessarily, that's more of a facility decision. But you can see that the utilization hits about that 85 to 87%, which is a good utilization. Free and reduced lunch count actually balances in the division. And so the comparison is that when you take them out of the Booker T. Washington pathway, this impacts that free and reduced lunch count, but it also impacts the Maury free and reduced lunch count. But where we see the biggest impact on free and reduced and our measure, the measure that we have of socioeconomic, is really starts at that middle grades, which is, again, in past presentations, I've said several times that one of the keys to diversification will probably be starting in the middle, is the middle grades and letting it go both directions. But I think it has to start somewhere. Now, this is a small change, but we believe that it offers a pathway that's a middle grades pathway that's actually in closer proximity to the neighborhood, has capacity at the building, and can enhance the enrollment of a declining enrollment in that area feeder pattern. And so we can stabilize that enrollment going through that pathway. Yes, Mr. Jordan.
So in your chart, can you just kind of show us the current and impact of the
So the current,
recommendation?
and I didn't put that on here just for lack of room, but the current on, at the middle school level, when you're looking at Booker T and that pathway in the middle school is above 80% on free and reduced lunch count. And so we're dropping that some, not a whole lot, it's a couple percentage points. So you can see it's at 79% of the Booker T pathway. It's above 80 right now, and so we make a small impact on that. And again, any progress towards diversification works, and then you can't make it all in one move, but this is one step in the equation to do that. What we do, and then at the middle school at Maury, is actually this is about the same. It's about a 2% difference also, lower, but it's about the same. You don't make a huge impact because the number of students that we're taking from St. Helena is only maybe about 50 kids. And that's at 100% cohort going in. So if all 50 choose to go to this pathway instead of a middle school pathway of choice, then this would be the number.
Can you state that one more time?
Okay, so we have approximately, and again, it's an estimate, about 50 kids at the 5th grade level at St. Helena right now. If all 50 choose to go to that pathway, that's the percentage number, okay? If they choose, whatever other choice pathway, that would change that percentage a little bit, certainly. But we're assuming all 50, because it's a live-in projection on that. Does that make sense?
And reminder that St. Helena is a school with, whose enrollment is slightly below 300. So for context.
Yeah.
That's why, the 50 students at 5th grade.
Yes. Yes.
Hop in one.
Oh, yeah.
But
Mr. Jordan.
just for clarification, so on the right-hand side of the chart, this is a projection of what the numbers would be
That's correct.
based upon the recommendation.
That's correct, yes.
And likewise, on the left-hand side of the chart, this is what the feeder pattern would be based upon the recommendation.
That's correct. Yeah. Now, the change to this, and again, this is where I hope this is, and I hope I'm making this clear, I hope it's not coming out confusing because I don't want it to be, that regardless of the high school recommendation you make for a comprehensive CTE, whether it's 100% choice or a small boundary, that can change this feeder pattern, but you can make the St. Helena decision independent of the high school decision. Because this works either way. If in the recommendation of a K-8 at Lake Taylor, we would have to place St. Helena kids somewhere anyway, if the choice was to go in that direction. So they don't have a middle school feeder if that happens. And so I think initially the discussion around St. Helena was around that, but as we did some deeper dive into it, we understood that this can be a recommendation independent of other decisions you make. And we actually think it's a good one on this one. Yes, ma'am.
Dr. Gabriel, then Ms. Doyle.
Go ahead.
So the students that are currently at St. Helena right now, they are zoned to attend Lake Taylor Middle.
Yes,
And then after Lake Taylor Middle, Booker T. Washington.
that's correct.
And the charts that you have on the side, the socioeconomic,
I'm sorry.
No.
No,
They go to Lake Taylor.
they go to Lake Taylor High School. Yeah, Lake Taylor.
Taylor High School,
Yeah.
okay.
And I guess I misstated that. I should have went to the Lake Taylor free and reduced lunch count, not the Booker T. Washington. Sorry about that.
Okay.
That's my mistake. Sorry about that.
All right, so then, I understand your projection with the feeder pattern. On the socioeconomic and utilization metrics, under Maury High School, where it has middle school. Has 62%.
Correct.
Does that 62% take into consideration your suggestion of St. Helena?
It does.
It does,
It
okay.
does.
So it went from what to 62?
And I have that number, and I don't have it in front of me. I think it's 60.
Okay,
So it's not a big percentage change,
okay,
but it's a percentage direction we want to go.
okay.
It's not a
diversify.
big percentage change because the number of students
Yeah.
is not large.
Small.
In the grand scheme.
And then let me ask a long-term thought question. The students that will eventually be going to Maury High School, if the board were to consider any type of programmatic expansion of the medical health sciences program, will that affect the capacity at Maury High School?
It definitely would. I think that we have it at about, again, the live-in is about 87%, which tells me that the utilization of the building would be about 85% anyway, with transfers probably. And so, and again, it depends on your high school decision, but I will tell you that if you went to 100% choice at the comprehensive CTE, the answer is different. Because technically what we would be doing on paper is overutilizing and oversubscribing all the high schools.
Okay, so if we were to
Technically.
redistrict the CTE, and more students would be going to Maury, and you add the St. Helena change, then the program, if that becomes a
There is
thought-
potential for that,
Potential
yeah.
for that, okay.
Because then it's just about a marketing about how you attract students from different parts of the division to get to the comprehensive high school.
And we're gonna talk about that.
Yeah, we'll
in a
talk
minute.
about that in a
See,
minute.
that's the 1,200 that is bled off of the other 4 high schools, eventually
That's
goes,
correct.
that goes to the
On paper, they have to go somewhere, even though
Yeah.
in reality, they
That's just
won't.
paper numbers right now.
Right. Yes.
So what is the current utilization of Maury today?
It's,
I had that information,
it's 97%.
yeah, 97.
So then this is a reduction to 87%?
Well, this is the live-in. Again, this is the live-in because of, we don't count transfers in this one.
So what would it be with live-in plus transfers plus 50?
Well, again, it may depend on your program choice and time, but if it's at 97%, we're probably, with 50 kids, it's probably 98%. It's not a huge
Which
impact.
is way higher than your typical utilization.
Yeah.
Or recommended utilization of
Correct.
80-ish%.
Yep,
That's correct.
absolutely, yeah.
And that's the same for Blair, too, where we're bumping up on the higher end of the utilization?
And we would be,
Where's 90?
yeah, and, yeah, exactly. But without and depending on the Lake Taylor Middle School decision, without a middle school pathway, this would be, with the exception of, I guess you could take it into, well, we've explored the idea of a Ruffner Booker T. Washington, but that doesn't reach your goal of diversity. That actually compounds hyper-poverty through
Right.
one pathway, and we don't want to do
Right.
that.
And then I think the other factor we need to weigh in with Maury is what we end up doing with that building itself.
Exactly.
And then how
That'll
that
be-
is accommodating the current and
Yep.
future capacity desired.
Exactly, and the work that we have done with that is what was a 21st century high school environment with a core of that specialty program being its focal point and everything else from it. So that's the work that we've been doing separate from this as it relates to the Maury work.
Right, but it definitely needs to come back into the conversation.
Oh,
to help
absolutely.
Absolutely.
We overlaid in this, but because that was already in a different pathway.
Okay.
So there's, I mean, as we know, this all ties together in some way, shape, or form, yes.
Does.
Well, not to, were you
No,
next?
go ahead.
Okay.
No, yeah.
To throw a wrench in this even further.
Sure, please do.
So we're talking about diversifying as we make changes to the feeder pattern of one school, but if we're talking, I guess I'm having trouble thinking about it in isolation when I feel like we really have to be looking at our district globally
Right.
in reducing
Yeah.
the poverty levels in some of our schools, because I'm even thinking like Southside STEM, for instance, like what we may, I personally feel like that's still a point of discussion, what we do there in terms of decreasing poverty and how that might affect St. Helena and other school boundaries and utilization at those schools.
Well, let me start, and I'll certainly ask Tracy to chime in and add on. This work was precipitated initially because of the reality of excess capacity in our secondary schools. So we started with that, but in order to address secondary schools, we have to put a face on the elementary programming. The elementary schools are in, along with the middle schools, are in that neighborhood model. Addressing the feeder patterns on the front end of this begins to navigate some of that in the future. But in order to, Southside STEM aside, I mean, we know that situation. But outside of that, we would have to totally redo elementary boundaries to get anywhere close to what we would have, and what's our capacity to accomplish that, both logistically and with the will to be able to do that. So our thinking is, we start with the secondary piece, we do some cleanup of the feeder patterns, which then begin to get at, and Tracy said it earlier, we're kind of building from both ends. We're feeding it from both ends, with the middle schools being that linchpin of how we begin some of the changes with those. Also, for schools like Southside STEM and Compostela, Tidewater, PB Young, Jaycox, there's still the impact that will come from that St. Paul's quadrant. So it's not off the table, but until we have some definitive timelines and actions related to that work, you know, we've been back and forth, and I said it to the city manager and his team, we've all talked about it. We can't bring that rest of that recommendation until we know what's going to happen in that area and when. Because that will be our point to really think about how do we serve students. One of the things we want to know, students who move out of the public housing in those areas, where will they go when they are in Norfolk? So what's going to be the impact on those schools? So until we have some more data to feed that, you know, that part of the chess, those chess pieces have to stay still on the table, on the board. There's also some revitalization and downsizing that's proposed to occur on the south side with both Oakleaf and Diggstown. And so that too is a piece of what we're factoring in to what will be some impact. And so until we have full visibility, some declared timelines, some yes, this is what's going to happen with the public housing pieces, our elementary piece is going to remain uncertain for a little while. And I'll trace out.
And I will tell you, that's, for me, you know, I like clarity in where we're going, but we are provided no clarity in that. I think that, you know, we've got, I mean, just add in the idea that even in our low-income housing, that we have an aging population because we're seeing extended stay in low-poverty housing. So those kids are actually aging out. What used to be a smaller transition time from public housing into whatever the next level of housing would be, we're actually seeing neighborhoods that are of low housing that are producing less kids because the stay has been longer. And so we're trying to balance that on top of whatever the city's going to decide. I mean, look, we have Ruffner sitting there at 50% utilized, and maybe as far as condition of building, maybe one of your better buildings in the entire division. But without some guidance about what's happening in the St. Paul's quadrant, and then even south of the river, because that's going to impact what happens at Southside STEM, those are things that I don't know. I mean, I'm almost stumbling, and I don't do that very often here because I kind of know your division pretty well. These are question marks for us, because I agree with you. I think that the long systemic look at this thing is to systemically get it right. I think this is our first effort at doing a geographical balance. We've done it through choice, and we've made that decision in choice, regardless of how we got there or what it is. That's worked. Now we're doing it through geography, which goes back to our concept of a neighborhood and choice concept in your division that invests in both. So I think we're able to do it through a boundary move this time, instead of just making it a choice. And so I believe that's a positive for us in this, but completely on board with you on that.
We're there with you.
Yeah.
I'm going to come back to you, Dr. Robinson.
And again, I go back to the CTE proposal. That could theoretically pull 400 students out of each high school, out of the remaining four, or 300 out of the remaining four. Or, yes,
Yes.
300 out of the remaining four. And I don't think we're going to fix this in one swoop. It's going to have to be phased in over a period of time. We can't undo decades of neglect and I won't say mismanagement, but the way it's developed over the years, and try to fix it in one, kind of go in baby steps, I think. And I think the St. Helena thing is a good option of trying to diversify the system as best we can.
Yeah, and to completely agree with it. I don't think, I think it's happened over time. Dr. Boone did a great job in our first steering committee of outlining the last 30 years of Norfolk and how changes have happened and decisions made outside of our control as a school board to be able to make good decisions about how we path our kids through our system. Regardless of facility condition, it costs just to do that. But it's made it difficult to navigate that. So, and as we've gone out to the community and we've talked about how small the rudder is, to change and just keep steering in the right way. And I think we've made some real positive impacts in the last 3 or 4 years. That's become obvious through our programmatic successes and our academic successes. But I still think there's a lot of work to do. And this is one small step, again, and I'm going to talk about the more systemic thing at the end of this presentation for the spring work that we're going to be doing.
Yeah, and I don't want to, I like what you're doing in terms of giving us pieces to act upon and make some decisions. My advocacy on the board in terms of whenever we have this conversation about things that are outside of our control, so I personally have a difficulty with that because I think everything is within my control, even though it's not. But but I do think that as a school division and as the advocates for children in public school in Norfolk, that I don't subscribe to the idea that the school board should sit back and wait.
Yeah.
I think that we've done this work, we've put a lot of effort into it, and so to me, based upon the work that we've done over the last 4 or 5 years and what we know, we ought to be at the table advocating and working to influence housing and economic policy so that the triangle fits together. I think one of the reasons that we're struggling today is that too often it's either been one side of the street dictating to the other or vice versa.
Right.
But I think what we have the opportunity to do is to say, based upon, I think this is what we have told the council and the public, is that we're going to come back and say, if we want to be a cornerstone of a proudly diverse community, if we want to see utilization, if we want the school division to be a positive asset and anchor to the growth and development of the city, these are the things that we recommend that you consider. So if we're looking at the south side, the St. Helena and the Campus Stella and the Lake Taylor Middle and the Lake Taylor High attendance zones, please, city, stop putting more low-income housing in an area that's going to make it difficult for us to achieve what we say we want to achieve. So I don't think we should just sit back and say, hey, it's some decision somebody's going to make and we're going to react. I think just as you described a both ends process in the previous recommendation, I think that holds true for what we do. There's the reality of what we have, and these are some decisions that we're going to make today or this year or in the coming years. But we also know if we're going to get to the big picture, these are some things we're going to have to do differently, and let's have that tough conversation around how do we do that and have community will to accept it. So that's the part that just makes me uneasy when I hear the conversation around outside of our control, like we're going to just throw our hands up in the air.
So let me frame it in terms of the work that's not being presented and what I'm involved with. I mean, these are the conversations that I'm having with city staff, with NRHA, when I'm put at the table, the group that the city manager is putting together around this, and education will be at the table. These are the exact things that we're saying that we're doing, and we're delivering the message. And I believe when we have the next joint meeting with council, where we intend to discuss this educational planning work, that's the perfect time to insert all of these pieces. So when I say that we aren't ready to do some of that work, it's because we don't know if there are going to be enough students there. We are ready to say and have said we need more diverse schools socioeconomically. But where kids are going to be, it makes no sense for us to draw boundaries and tinker with boundaries and all the hours it takes with that if that entire sector of the city is no longer part of what will be geocoded, and how long it will take for students to return to that community and where would they be educated. We're simply saying we need some more information. It's not that we aren't, that we're waiting, but we need some timelines, because when we talk about this work, even as we go forward, we're going to talk about some things that we need to phase in to make this happen. You heard the phasing in by grade level for Camp Allen and Sewell's Point. There's some work that we'll be phasing, but until we understand what the true picture is, then we can go back to the table and start moving all of our pieces and do some recommendations. One of the things we're trying now to monitor is where are students moving even before the public housing move out occurs. So our current students, where are they going if they're leaving addresses where they are, which has them, most of them attending either Tidewater Park or PB Young? Where are they showing up in school? So we can begin to monitor, because it'll go back to the facilities piece too. What will be the capacity of schools to receive students all across the city if we have a couple of schools offline, even if there's a school to return to that community? What will be the time frame for that? So I'm with you. You know, this is, I think if Doug Smith was saying here, he would probably say, yes, that's the voice in my ears every time we meet. When we had our last team meeting and we were talking about these things, I constantly reminded them that you all have to think about it through the lens of decisions that you make and the impact on education. The richness of going through the work of this revenue sharing model proposal allows us to bring those conversations into that also. And there have been a few aha moments as we've initiated this work of things they hadn't thought about, of city decisions that would impact school operations. So we're there, we're right with you.
Well, and if I might add to that, I think that, to be frank, the conversations that we continue to have in the community are of past doings. I understand we got to get through that healing, and I understand we got to learn from that.
We just don't want to repeat
But
it.
it is, that's exactly right. But we spend 75% of our conversation in task force talking about everything that the school board did and the city did to just take it to the community. Now, we need to shift that conversation. We've heard it, we know the issues that we're dealing with, and we can't forget those lessons. I'm going to tell you, this community's not going to let us do that anyway. And I'm not suggesting that that's a bad thing to do. But part of the transition of good planning is the idea that, okay, let's get that dirty laundry done. Now, we've got to move forward. Now, the decisions we make will shape it, so we don't have this conversation here say everything the city used to do or the whatever used to do did this to us. But part of the conversation has to be with our community as we grow and we move forward. That, you know, if you listen to Saturday morning was 70% about the past.
Yes.
And so but we had to hear it, and the community has to go through that. There's no question they have to go through it. But we need to shift that conversation to that be 70% of the conversation to be, this is how we're going to fix it. And then we're in the driver's seat.
Right, and two things I want to say that put us in the driver's seat. One is the CTE high school is the school district's, the school board's effort in conjunction with the business community. So we are driving that bus as it relates to the comprehensive CTE high school. So we aren't waiting for that. The second thing I want to say is that we do have an opportunity, and for the thumbnail version of what happened with New Orleans, prior to the storm, they had a crisis in their schools. I had an opportunity to be part of the recovery for their schools. And just as Tracy described, even when I facilitated work with the community group that was there for Bring New Orleans Education Back, one of the things I learned was that they couldn't see a vision for the future because of past hurts that had never been addressed. I have never forgotten that message. And I've taking that here and here. And so when I hear Tracy saying we've talked about acknowledging the history is true, it's real, we still are impacted by it every day. But we have to allow ourselves to springboard from the history to what are possibilities. Not, well, see, we asked that 50 years ago. I get that. But what are the possibilities? And because New Orleans couldn't take that springboard, couldn't make that leap, they missed an opportunity when all of their schools were closed and there were some challenges around school performance to bring them back in the way. I don't want us to miss that opportunity. We're going to pay due diligence and give the time to discuss what the past has meant to Norfolk Public Schools. But at the same time, we're going to do some forward pushing. So when you hear we didn't stay there for 2 hours one night, that's going to be true because we've got to put something on the board that we're mapping to say what will the future look like. And so we understand that.
And I don't, I mean, we can stay here all night, but I think that I appreciate the New Orleans example, but I'm not sure I don't necessarily see the direct parallel to here, but I get the concept. And I promise you that probably sitting around this table, no one has spent more time over the last 20 years dealing with trying to find this balance between healing and moving forward. But I also think it's important when people talk history, they're not talking 50 years ago. Okay? They're talking about 5, 10. In some cases, the discussion we had about choice at the Southside STEM Academy, that's not 50 years ago.
That's right.
That's a couple of years ago.
That's right.
So what happens is when we're willing to make these decisions and stand on these decisions and not shy away from the commitment that we've made around trying to be the cornerstone of a proudly diverse community, the more we demonstrate that we're willing to stand, sometimes you're going to win some, sometimes you're going to lose some.
Yep.
But if you waffle, that's what causes people to have question about your willingness to stand. Because you can talk about the history all you want to, but history is supposed to inform us for the decisions that we make going forward.
That's right. Yep.
And so if we aren't comfortable or careful, and I mean, it's one thing to acknowledge the pain, deal with it every day.
Yeah.
But ultimately, people are going to judge us by the decisions that we make and the results that we produce.
Yep.
And so at the end of the day, if we make decisions and stand on those decisions and demonstrate that we are truly going to act in the best interest of all children, we don't have a problem. But,
And I think we're all
the
in
proof will
agreement.
be in the pudding as these
Sure.
decisions come before us.
But again, to perhaps bring this full circle and close this piece, is that until we have a little more data to inform our work and recommendations to the board for elementary, we haven't taken it off the table. We just need more data to bring to the board a reasonable set of recommendations that will get to the goals that we have.
Right. And when you say the data that you need, you're talking about that's out of our control.
That's correct. So we're monitoring where the kids are moving across the district, or if they're leaving the city from those neighborhoods, what will be the impact? Because when we come back with some elementary work, we may have to talk about, yes, we have facility condition index information, but then what will be the impact on schools? And there may be some prioritization of projects that will be driven by where elementary students are showing up
Right.
in the other elementary schools.
So before you move on, any other questions on this St. Helena
No.
concept?
Move it on.
Okay. Ms. Doyle, you had
No, I
something?
just,
Okay.
no, I'm waiting for
Okay.
the next.
Okay, so in all that being said, the move forward and to not come in with a kind of a waffling decision, the reason I'm going to show you still our preliminary options is because when we make this decision, this has to be a solid decision on both of these two factors. And that's the reason I'm coming to you to just give you the outline of what we have in front of us. Now, this is a repurpose of Lake Taylor Middle School into a pre-K-8 with Fairlawn and Poplar Hall.
Just for clarity, so we have
You have two recommendations.
two recommendations.
Yes, I'm sorry.
And at some point, in the next couple of months or so,
Sooner than that, I would hope.
I mean, I don't know. I'm just saying, at some point,
It's,
you're going to, because we have to have public hearings and those things.
that was my point. Unless the board tells us to go back and rework some of these recommendations, we can begin the next phase on those first two, which would move it into further board discussion, I think, first, because you're receiving it tonight. If the board discusses it again, and then move into the public hearings for those initial two recommendations, with the other work continuing in the interim. So that's my understanding of the process that we've employed in Norfolk Public Schools before, is that once a solid set of recommendations comes before the board, we can then move to the discussion phase, both with the board and with the community, receive input, and then that would guide whether or not we have to go back, whether you all direct us to go back and tweak or start all over with this. But so that's,
So just for our benefit, I don't know if it'll be the end of this meeting, but just have, as we go through the rest of this, what the board would like to be on how to address the recommendation that we've got thus far. Okay? Everybody good on that? Okay.
So in the repurpose of the middle school to a pre-K 8 with Fairlawn and Poplar Halls, and this is pointed out, and I've changed this language a little bit from the meetings this week, but this past week, and I've changed the language, and I hope, Mr. Jordan, this is probably more to the intent. But in the fall of 2018, due to program or to grade progression, Southside STEM will no longer be a typical feeder into Lake Taylor, okay, because of the progression of grades.
and meaning that they will then be a full K-8 school starting next school year. So they will have a full complement from grades K through 8.
Is that, well,
But there's
well, dependent on your decision, again, but in the grade progression, that's the way
Well,
we
no,
should.
I know, I'm going to push back on that.
Okay.
The school was designated as a K-8, and at some point,
It was built for
the
that.
school will be serving grades K through 8. Now, who's being served, that's the board's discussion. But the school will be serving in 8th grade for the next school year, meaning we would have completed the K-8 progression.
Yes.
Yeah.
I have a quick question concerning that. Would all the live-in students in the Southside STEM Academy zone be able to attend the?
If you let us go through
Okay,
this,
all
we'll
right.
get to
We
some
may
of
get
that.
there, yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Okay. So in that, in essence, then, Lake Taylor, then middle school, as a middle school, has an estimated utilization of approximately 50%. I'm going to tell you, that 50% still includes St. Helena students, because at this point, I don't have a recommendation to move forward on St. Helena. So if you take that St. Helena out, that actually reduces some then. So that utilization of that facility that gets reduced.
And you will recall,
The live-in
Southside
viewers.
STEM
live-in viewers,
Academy
yes.
has been serving approximately 100 middle school students at grades 6 and 7, the majority of whom would have normally attended Lake Taylor Middle if Southside STEM K-8 hadn't been developed, and/or if the board had changed the attendance boundaries as it relates to Southside STEM. So that's where, when we talk about the 50% reduction over 3 years, as we've talked since I've been here, losing roughly 100 students a year from Lake Taylor Middle is how we've gotten to the 50% capacity for Lake Taylor Middle, based on 300 students coming out.
Yes, Mr.
Well, in that context, someone can offer, perhaps give me some clarification. So when we had the discussion about the Southside STEM attendance zone, and the fact that we had students who were traditionally going to Lake Taylor Middle, but lived in the Southside STEM attendance zone, we had conversations around the difference between, pros and cons of a K-8, pros and cons of a traditional middle school, comprehensive middle school, whatever the appropriate language is. And I thought part of the conversation was that we knew that there was a great likelihood, because once you designate the school the way it was designated, that there would be a certain amount of appeal, just for no other reason, because it was a new school, and because of the programmatic offering that we had put there. But we also said that for many families, the middle school component can be attractive because of sports, extracurricular activities, and things that one is able to receive at a traditional middle school that in theory you would not be able to receive at a K-8.
Right.
So part of where my hesitation comes in is when I read on the sheet of paper about the grade progression, I don't have any real evidence of what type of marketing and communication that has gone forward to families that explains the difference between the two and tries to let families make decisions based upon what they think is best. So that's the part that as we have this conversation, I just want to get some clarity around, because in your scenario, when we talk about the possibility of changing the attendance zones or taking Lake Taylor Middle School offline as a traditional middle school, can you describe what that means in terms of offerings to children that they currently can receive at Lake Taylor Middle School that they would not have access to based upon the recommendation that's coming forward?
Let me take the first stab at that. Because we have a pattern of program delivery for our K-8 schools, we started it with the original Ghent school. And so they have some arts, they have some athletics. Numbers dictate whether or not they can field any full teams. They are able to do some teams, but then they're able to participate with the middle school if they want something else beyond what we have. That model was what was replicated at Crossroads. There's some athletics, there's some arts, but not at the full complement of arts courses that you would have at a comprehensive middle school, at a Northside or Blair or wherever. So same thing then is what we put in place for Southside STEM. Just as Crossroads grew into the 8th grade, growing into the 8th grade, so our numbers are small in terms of athletics and the arts because we just have 2 grades in there. But then once we get to the 300 pupil, regardless of where they come from, the 300 pupils roughly in middle school, then that determines what they can have in additional for athletics. Most of the K-8 schools can't field a football team. You don't have enough students for a football team. So K-8 schools don't have a football team. That's something, a middle school football teams, which, by the way, commercial, the Super Bowl for middle school is tomorrow night at Powhatan Station at 6. Look, there's a lot of stuff going on here. And so that's one of those pieces that we see not happening. We have with middle school programming at Rosemont for both Young Scholars and the Academy of International Studies, we again have had some options for students to return to their schools, the schools they normally would have attended if they had gone to their neighborhood middle schools, for participation. But now we've actually started internally some conversations, not there yet, so don't anybody run off and say we're going to do this. But now that we have 2 programs at Rosemont, can we allow them to do like a K-8 school and have a couple of small programs? They do have a couple of things there. So this is how we have mapped it out. Now, in terms of how that's marketed, again, as parents apply for these programs, these specialty schools, the K-8s, or if you're outside of an attendance boundary, because I remind the board also did not shift the attendance boundary for Crossroads. They too became a neighborhood K-8. Not dissimilar from Southside STEM. And so that's how that communication and marketing goes on. Also, when we do the secondary school work, the middle school programming where we bring parents in and they can see what are the options and the things that are going on. That's the way in which we discuss those.
Ms. Basine.
Is it okay?
Yes.
So with Southside STEM, are 100% of the 5th graders staying for 6th grade?
Dennis, actually, I just asked Dennis for the 6th grade enrollment, but the 6th grade enrollment at Lake Taylor is significantly less than 7th and 8th grade. So he's gonna go get me that number, because
Okay.
I anticipate that question coming.
Okay, all right. Well,
The question usually is, what's the progression from fifth to sixth?
Yeah.
yeah, that's what
To
I'm
the
asking.
schools, yeah, from fifth to sixth. Last year, we had, I think, 95 fifth graders, and we planned for 95 sixth graders to move into it, so Dennis is gonna get those numbers.
He's gonna,
Right.
and it'll be a clear indicator at Lake Taylor Middle School, because whatever the decrease
Yeah.
between the two grade cohorts is, they stayed they likely stayed at Southside STEM. We're gonna, and I won't know that until I get the live at 10 analysis, but likely a majority of them probably stayed in that grade progression.
Right.
But let me add one other piece to where Mr. Jordan was opening up this part of the conversation. 100 students at a grade level at Southside STEM does not support the total number of middle school age students that live in that attendance zone. So there are some students who have chosen to go to Lake Taylor Middle. So we need to show that middle school students from that area are being served at two schools primarily. Of course, our specialty programs, we have students there, AOIS or Lakewood or Young Scholars. But, so there are students that are attending Lake Taylor Middle and students that are attending Southside STEM from the same attendance zones.
So the 8th grade class this year is 224, the 6th grade class is 150. So that's the difference between, because
At
Southside
Lake Taylor
STEM,
Middle.
yeah, at Lake Taylor Middle, because Camp Estelle is now 6-7.
Yeah,
So that's the difference, at 224, so about 75 kids less,
okay.
which are
At-
likely staying.
at Lake
in the-
Taylor Middle.
Correct.
Okay. And then, if you could educate me, I was trying to understand, is the number of students enrolled 6th, 7th, and 8th the reason why the decision was made previously for no athletic program at those schools, or?
No, and again, I'm gonna go, K-8s have athletic programs, but you don't have the number of students to field certain teams,
Right.
certain sports. And so, but it was also the understanding that because the numbers are smaller, that's one of the trade-offs that you make as a parent in opting for a K-8 school that has a smaller middle school than the comprehensive middle school would have been. So you know that that's one of the trade-offs, but you gain that smaller environment if that's what you were looking for your child. So that's always been the case at Ghent, and then on to Crossroads, and now at Southside STEM.
So can we continue to talk about the Lake Taylor, then pre-K-8 and Fairlawn Poplar, so that we can ask the questions about, okay, for the pre-K-8 there, what does that mean for them for sports, arts, and
Right,
other?
yeah, so we.
So in that case, and again, you follow that same progression, one of the ideas of, okay, so for both of these buildings to come into this building, what we would be looking at, the approximate, it's about a 900 student station, or about 8, with transfer out, we anticipate it actually to be less. So we're talking about 500, 250 with transfer out if the trends stay the same. So 500 elementary, 250, again, doesn't warrant that athletic program. Certainly with Camp Estelle being the same feeder, trying to figure out if that's the balance. As we talked to the athletic, and then actually the athletic director sent me kind of where they go currently because of size, that you already do that. Again, I think that this is the trade-off here, is that even in traditional K-8 education models, there's no such thing as intramural sports. They're all intramural. So they don't compete outside their school in a typical, if you were to look at the true definition of a K-8. And so, but we don't do that because we want to offer our kids those athletic programs. We want to offer them all the abilities to participate. So in this case, it'd be the same. We would be, now, but I'm going to tell you the difference here of Lake Taylor, that to Mr. Jordan's point about having a middle school choice then, the only choice then, because Munier's, 6 middle schools right now, you have 2,500 extra seats. Now, 2,500, which means that if this doesn't become something of the combination or whatever it is, then a middle school comes offline. I mean, you can't afford to keep 2,500 extra seats at that small amount of students. We've tried to get through that utilization discussion. So the other pathway then would just have to, which is the geographical pathway, would have to be Ruffner, because there's capacity at that building. But what that does is compound the socioeconomic diversity that we're trying to break apart, because that's how that would work. Unless you decided that pathway could be Ruffner to another high school other than Booker T. Okay, so that's the domino effect of trying to figure out if it's a middle school, but in a middle school that there's simply not the demographic to fill Lake Taylor anymore. And there won't be, regardless of, because you're always going to have a neighborhood and choice balance at Southside STEM, whatever that decision is moving forward. But the typical pathway of geography comes through that pathway and through St. Helena, which again only compounds the problem of lack of diversity. And so we're trying to make both moves happen. And in this case, looking at both utilization and even condition of buildings, so the idea behind this, especially with the comprehensive CTE school, is that the advantage of a middle school, even a smaller middle school here, is that the access to exploratory coursework and bridging the CTE down into middle grades is a huge potential here, because you have the resources and you'll have the staffing to allow some early exploration of career and technical courses that you're going to be offering there. And so we can actually expand the program offerings at a middle school program because we have a full resource that is going to be a full resource of high school exploration. And so I think that what we tried to do was look at exactly that, because all those points of the advantages and disadvantages of K versus middle grades we've been through, but trying to balance some of that programmatic effort by tying a true pathway that comes from either STEM or comes in the middle school pathway, because you have a smaller population there. And you don't have the expense of extra resources and extra space because they're right there on the same campus. That was another component of looking at this direction. And so, and again, with all those things in mind, that still trying to figure out the athletics, trying to figure out, and in this case, frankly, the athletics at Lake Taylor wouldn't have to change. The Southside STEM students are going to Lake Taylor for their middle school program, athletic program anyway, because that's where they go. That's what their typical school would be to go to athletic programs. So this actually doesn't change. It'd be the same students participating at the same middle school for the same sports programs. There's not a big change here for that, other than it's a K-8, you're staying in your neighborhood to stay at that. But still, the Southside STEM students, because it's a K-8, have a choice to go to a school, and that choice is Lake Taylor. Does that make sense? Mm-hmm. Okay, so that being said, part of this effort, though, is looking at Fairlawn and Poplar Halls. What we do understand, though, is that because of the current numbers, we're not sure that this, and again, this is why this is still just an option, is that this is a one-year transition. Because of those big classes that still exist in the middle school, to transfer out, to make it a self-feeder, the current numbers are 150, 174, and 224. But with 150 and 174 at the 6th and 7th grade rising level, there won't be enough capacity at Lake Taylor in that current facility to host a K-8.
Until when?
Until this 6th grade class is transitioned out. And so, which would be a 2-year transition from this point. Mm-hmm. And so, in this case, and I'm not willing to, this is why I don't want to make a recommendation on there, is that do we make a transition where it's and I'm not sure, I'm not going to tell you I even like this, is that do you start kind of a 3-8 until you can make that transfer work because of capacity? And I don't think that's a programmatic thing that we want to do yet. Now, the other option is that we can explore a boundary change, that we can balance some of the enrollment by taking some of those kids that are in the north part of the Poplar Halls Fairlawn boundary, and we can actually shift them north to and get them into a school that has capacity to handle those students to reduce that number. So we can combine this with a boundary change that actually balances utilization at the elementary school and has the potential for balancing some more socioeconomic balance by doing that. And so when we're talking about, and actually the school I'm talking about is just shifting up into the Coleman Place and Sherwood Forest area. So if you take the north part of that boundary, we can explore that boundary change, because north of, I think it's Hampton Road, the 4-lane, is at Hampton Boulevard, which is a 4-lane crossing that those students actually cross over, and they cross actually the 64 to get to their school too. They would actually just stay on that side. So it may be a potential boundary change along with this to make it work in a one transition. But again, one of the reasons that we are not going to make this yet is because of, first of all, the programmatic questions that you have, and second of all, that we could potentially look at a boundary change to make this in one transition.
And let me also say, when we get to the facility condition index conversation, Poplar Halls is one of our schools that does not fare well.
Yeah, and this is, yeah, and that's exactly it. You can walk in that building, I will tell you, I walked in last spring, and that principal keeps that building as beautiful a building you can take. But when it rains, there's buckets in the hallways, there's trash cans in the hallways, there's trash cans everywhere trying to collect rainwater. I'm not thrilled about its location, to be honest with you, at the end of the day. I don't like it right next to an entry ramp on a highway. So but we know we do schools like that. We have done in the past. I just think we could do this. Now, it would increase some transportation costs. I think that the one other thing I need to introduce here is that something we're going to have to talk about is that the transportation about these K-8 buildings and understanding, and I don't want to go down this rabbit hole because this is controversial and it will be, but I'm going to put it out there to you so you know it's out there. But without an exploration of start times for middle grades, especially in K-8, this will add a transportation that we may not be able to handle.
Right.
So
see, we're getting there.
Yeah.
we do consider, so this will be a starting point for start time, whether it's a hybrid start time or whether it's a middle grade start time. You can start K-8 schools at different times if you want. However you want to handle that, but without doing that, this move alone has a potential of 10 to 15 buses. So we need to have that conversation about start time. And that's outside of my purview. I'm going to let you duke that one out.
We got it.
And then the other piece that comes into play here that you haven't touched on is that it allows us to repurpose the building for the alternative ed.
And that's the next piece to that, is that it's a,
Talk about that.
yeah. So in this case where. Oh, I'm
Go
sorry.
ahead and do that, and then I'd
Okay,
like
then,
to follow that.
I'm sorry. So with that, with the Madison School, understand that Fairlawn actually has some walkers to the building, but Fairlawn doesn't sit in a traditional neighborhood.
No.
It's one of the few schools that really doesn't. And so it ends up being a good access building for a district-wide program, and an alternative program especially. The building is actually conducive for this. I mean, we have to make some modifications, and mostly in plumbing, I guess, everywhere. But the building is actually built to separate, to be a good building for a program like this. So I think that's a win for this one. And then you would take Fairlawn, actually you would take Poplar Halls, which you're gonna see is probably one of your worst conditioned buildings offline too. So it reduces some elementary capacity and takes care of that middle school capacity issue that we're having too. Dr. Robinson.
I'm open to the concept here. I'm concerned about converting a middle school to an elementary school usage for two reasons: the size of the classrooms and the cost of repurposing and renovating and modifying for especially pre-K through 2 students.
Well, and
And then
Tracy
vice
just
versa.
said that vice versa, that what we would have to do for Madison to occupy Fairlawn would be the plumbing to upsize
Right.
the commodes and sinks and everything. And we would have to do some of that for at least the primary wing of the building that includes pre-K through probably first, maybe second grade. But what we also gain is great playground opportunity. And the configuration of Lake Taylor Middle allows some courtyard places where pre-K can almost be separated.
Now, my understanding is with pre-K classrooms that you have to have the bathrooms within the classroom itself?
You want that.
If there's new construction,
If there's new
There's
construction.
new
if
construction.
there's
we-
new
if we
construction
go-
or major renovation.
We don't have to go back and,
No, because our older buildings that have pre-K may not have bathrooms in those classrooms.
okay.
So
That's a
one of the
concern.
reasons that we'd like to come to this decision sooner than later is because part of this is a facility budget impact.
Oh, yeah.
And so that's one of the reasons we wanted to get this in front of you right now, even though we don't have a final decision, is to make sure that we can figure out what the dollars are gonna be for that. Yeah.
I mean, that was
On
one
top
of
of
the,
the
that was one of the reasons why we advocated that the Academy for Discovery at Lakewood was going to be 3 through 8 versus K through 8.
So I think that what the idea would be is that to figure out your modifications to make it accessible as possible. So, the most accessible potential of restroom access for those grade levels. Because you have the opportunity for playground space and that separation, the building is also actually very conducive to separation of grade level.
But do remember, there's also the offset of operational savings
Exactly.
when you close Poplar Halls. So we aren't going into this with a need for new money without taking some money off the table,
Right,
so.
yes.
And that's what I like about this recommendation, is that we're looking at the yin and the yang, which is what we know we've been over and under in certain capacity with buildings, and we know we've needed to take some offline. So this, in one fell swoop, does quite a bit, while we still need to take into consideration potentially a boundary change or whatever for these kids to be accommodated at a K at Lake Taylor Middle,
Correct, yes.
or not.
This is, if we're gonna do this, we're gonna have to move on it quickly.
Well-
Because I don't want us to rush a decision, but to ask our facilities people to retrofit these schools and have them prepared for next fall is
Oh,
gonna
no.
be,
Now, this one, remember, would not be next fall.
okay.
Remember
Because
what
I
we
think
said
we'd have to
about-
go through a zoning effort first and then do that. I think this is a 2-year transition regardless, but if we can't, but I think that, I mean, if you wanted to kind of shoehorn it in a little bit for next fall, we'd have to do some really quick stuff. I think this is a tough one for next fall. And regardless of the direction, I think between condition improvement, program improvement, boundary change potential, doing that, I just think it's really complicated to get done.
So it would be 1920?
So I would anticipate this could be a 1920 move, which gives us plenty of time for communication, program development, all those things that we need to do right, without closing a building to do it.
Yeah.
Just for, I'm sorry, did you have?
Go ahead.
Well, I was just going
You
to
have a
ask for
question.
with the previous recommendations, there was a socioeconomic and utilization metrics chart.
That's what I-
Do you have charts?
We will
associated?
get that for
We
you.
can get
Yeah,
that. That's
we-
what I said.
yeah.
That's the work still.
Because I want to get that boundary consideration in that we haven't considered yet, to see both.
Just be helpful.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. Okay. So then I'm going to take you in, and I'm going to give you an overview of the 4 options that were presented at the Lake Taylor Comprehensive CTE. The idea behind all of this, now we're anticipating that first, and I know the number can vary, but we're looking at 1,200, yes, I'm sorry.
I have
Oh,
I
I'm
have a
sorry.
few more clarifying questions about
Sure.
the fair loan options. Okay. So we would have Crossroads K-8, we would have Southside STEM Academy K-8, we would have Lake Taylor K-8,
And Ghent.
and
Okay.
Ghent K-8.
And Crossroads.
I said Crossroads,
Sorry.
and then Lakewood
No,
K.
Lake was 3A.
3A.
Three, well, yeah,
Okay.
3-8. I'm thinking of the extracurricular options and the athletic options. When I think extracurricular, I'm thinking music, arts, language,
Sure.
and then your athletics. So that leaves then, as far as a traditional middle school, that we think of Northside, Blair, Azalea,
Roughly.
and Ruffner. Okay, so that, there would be 4 that would have those options.
Right.
And so if the students are in the attendance zone, whatever the zones would be for those K-8 schools, if the families decided that they wanted that traditional middle school experience, then they could have that option. That would be something that we would.
That's
That
what
would be
we
our
would
goal.
have
Yeah,
to
we
put
could
into
flesh
the,
out.
yeah.
That would be our goal.
And then the other clarifying question that I have is, for the students that are zoned for popular halls, pre-K through 2, and grades 3 through 5, if we shift them to Lake Taylor, what is the program utilization in that building going to be? Not the live-in, but what is the
Capacity, yeah, the program.
capacity?
Okay,
That's the chart I was.
So it'll be, so the capacity of that building is 925 for Lake Taylor Middle School currently.
The capacity.
Is that about right?
What I'm looking at right here for Lake Taylor Middle is that it's at 70 utilization.
Correct.
Right.
So what we would do then is that, again, you want to get that building close to, now understand you're gonna hit capacity a little bit by shifting some to elementary, so it's a lower class size ratio that we calculate in there. So we actually think we're gonna take that capacity down probably 50 to 75 students, which means then we'd have our anticipation would be 750 students in the entire building, in a building of about 850. So our utilization, I mean, you're gonna hit that 85% pretty closely.
So there would be no option to expand, for example, pre-K.
I think if you wanted to, you could. I think that would look at, In this case, no, unless you were to make extensions on the building. But again, explore that in your renovation project.
These are just all questions that,
Sure.
you know,
Yeah.
need to take into consideration.
Which is a great, actually, it's an easy building to expand also, so I don't think that's out of the question. I think it's a site that's conducive for it. I think that Lake Taylor Middle has great bones. I think it needs work, but I think it has great bones. So I think in future consideration, that could be done, yeah.
Okay, thank you. That-
Sorry, can I just have one quick question? Today, Fairlawn, does it have portables or not?
Yes.
I thought so.
Yes,
So
yes.
would it not then have to utilize portables when we move Madison over because the capacity would be in building enough?
I think so. I
I'm-
think that's what we said.
Yeah, I think if I heard the question right, there would be, actually, there are more classrooms at Lake Taylor,
No, Fairlawn.
Fairlawn, but,
Fairlawn.
well, let me back into it a little bit. There's more classrooms at Lake Taylor Middle than there are at Fairlawn and Poplar Halls.
Right, so I'm saying no, Madison alternative goes
Correct.
to Fairlawn.
Yep.
We don't need to use any more
Nope,
portables.
nope, we could reduce
Right,
portables
so
there
again, it's
too.
another reduction of portables, which is
Right.
one of our aims.
Right, so we continue that pathway too.
Okay.
Ms. Basine?
Yep.
So, to get back to the athletics, and I think this extracurricular piece is important as we consider the Lake Taylor K-8 and potentially what decisions we may make about Southside STEM in the future if we want to re-examine that. But what I want to hear is that there is no objection or no policy that we currently have that says that we cannot have athletic programs there.
No, there's absolutely nothing that says. However, the more smaller units you put in place, the greater your costs are going to become for athletics. And I can certainly have Steve Sutton-Miller share with the board in a future meeting exactly how we play that out at both units. But I think, again, I caution us that if we are trying to do comprehensive middle school in a K-8, you're defeating the purpose of a K-8. You consciously make a choice to step away from some activities that would be available in a comprehensive school by opting into the K-8. And so, but yet, because we aren't taking all comprehensive middle schools offline, and that was part of Dr. Gabriel's question, what would be options for parents who may not want that? Because guess what? The K-8 middle school component is so much smaller, there's still going to be students outside of that who are going to have to be zoned for middle schools around.
Right, and I understand that if they're choice programs, but if we're talking about neighborhood K-8 schools where,
Well, that's what the district did with Crossroads.
well, I know that's what they did, but if we have this opportunity now, because, you know, one could look at it as an inequity in opportunities for students.
We have, first of all, middle school athletics is not a requirement, so.
It's not a requirement.
That's the first
And
thing.
and that's the second piece of my question, is that if we're not going to provide it, I mean, our surrounding districts don't have middle school athletics.
And I don't want to propose us moving away from it, but again, there's an issue of scale. When you only have roughly 300 students to occupy a middle school program, then you can't do all of the same program activities that you have at the comprehensive school. That's just simply by numbers. When you got 900 students that can field all of these teams versus 300, it just doesn't work. That's why we haven't had football teams at the K-8 schools, because you don't have enough students to put them on a team. But again, I hear the message, and we can certainly, you know, we'll work with Mr. Sutton-Miller and everybody else to look at what that feels. But do understand, if we're going to move into trying to replicate everything that a comprehensive school has, we're going to defeat some of the goals of understanding that there's the intimacy of a small school is a trade-off for some other things.
Right, and to be clear, I completely understand that, but I'm trying to, I guess, explore these issues that may impact an individual's decision to enroll their child in a school.
And
Not so
we'll
much
work-
that I'm
We'll work,
saying
yeah.
we must have an athletic program, because like
We
you said,
will have an
people
athletic
know,
program, because
people
we have
know,
it, yeah.
you know, X school doesn't have athletics at their school, but that's not high on my priority
Right.
list.
But
so-
they, again,
Yeah.
we don't have any schools with zero athletics.
I mean,
Big-
on-site at their school.
Right, but the K-8s, right, there are some things that are going on with the K-8s, and those are some of the conversations. But we'll work on Mr. Sutmiller coming back to the board
Okay.
with some of that information.
Yes, just so the board understands, I know the time, but I'm allowing the discussion to go on because I think it's important for the discussion to be had. So obviously, we may start our closed session a little later if that's okay. But I just want folks to understand, I just think it's important for us to have the discussion, for the questions to be asked.
Yes.
And I offered the chair earlier, but I knew you had a lot of stamina, so you can keep going.
All right, so we'll move on to the comprehensive CTE. Now, I want to avoid going down any sort of programmatic discussion on this,
Right.
because we are
That's a
really
totally different
focused
place.
on the boundary option here. Okay, this is hard not to go down the rabbit holes here. Boy, did, I probably don't need to be here heard any louder, that's for sure. But here's what we're gonna show you, is there's 4 options for that comprehensive CTE, with the understanding of this. I know that whatever the enrollment's going to be, the reason that we have 300 slots on here for 1,200 is that the current capacity of Lake Taylor is about 1,500. We think with modification to the building, with some spaces modification that you have to have, you're gonna impact it a little bit. And so we look at 1,200, but that doesn't mean that that's the final number. Okay, so we're just using that as an example to get in there. Are also across the board here that the understanding is that the current 9, 10, and 11 class, if this were to be implemented in the 2018-19 school year, the current 9, 10, and 11 classes would stay in that building, and they would progress through and graduate from Lake Taylor High School. And then what we would do is we would then anticipate a 300 student target number for district-wide choice in some way, shape, or form. So maintaining that grade progression. So 9th, 10th, and 11th, when they grow into the 10th, 11th, and 12th next year, the first choice class will be the 9th grade class for next year.
How many ninth graders go to Lake Taylor High School today?
Lake Taylor High School today, enrollment, we have that somewhere.
Go to your
I
next
should have had
question,
that
I'll
in front of
come
me. I'm
back.
sorry, I don't have that in
That's
front of me.
okay. Go get it. That's okay.
So we'll get that. So what I'm going to show you is basically 4 options, okay? And at a high level, the options are this, is that you could either have no boundary and have the building be 100% choice high school. And I'm going to show you the impact of that in a minute. The second choice would be have a limited geographical boundary, which would likely be the Lake Taylor pre-K-8 if that were the decision to go to pre-K, or middle school, whatever that is. So regardless, that limited boundary would be that Lake Taylor middle. Again, offering a neighborhood choice along with a division-wide choice. The third one would be a programmatic feeder, is that, and what we anticipate would be if you were to take the Southside STEM Academy in the program to extend the STEM program into the high school, career and technical, which is in the model for courses there, is to extend that. Then the final one would be a combination of the two. Now, and again, this really comes down to what it means. That in option 1, if it were to be 100% choice, what it first does is, and you can see that with a no boundary, you can actually see what it does in your map. You can go to the map here while I'm talking about it. But you can see what it does is it basically, if we just stick with, is it in time, it overutilizes and oversubscribes Granby, Maury, and Norview, which are already, Norview is already oversubscribed, okay? But what it does on paper is it oversubscribes those buildings. And frankly, it puts Booker T. Washington at 94%, which again, is far above our optimal utilization at facilities. And so, again, so in 100% choice then, you would have to, in a programmatic and a marketing sense, is how do we attract buildings from each of those live-in buildings to reduce the utilization at all 4 high schools with no boundary. Now, what this obviously does is it leaves all slots for choice, opens up for diversification, all those things that you want. But then it puts a real effort on marketing to the right areas to undersubscribe some buildings that are completely oversubscribed. So that's the challenge to that one. But again, I'm going to tell you, all four of these options I believe are good options. I don't think there's the last one maybe I would maybe shy away from, but because of the choice. But so in this one, that's the case. The numbers are there. This is an example. I want to tell you that this map on this next page is an example only. That what we've done is we've tried to just say, if this is what the boundary looked like. We haven't gone through the exercise of really deciding. But these numbers reflect that this is the feeder pattern, that we haven't really disrupted the feeder pattern, but basically what we've done is taken the Lake Taylor High School feeder pattern and then adjusted some of the feeders as we go through. And you can see on the next page what the feeder patterns would be. Okay. Again, example only. We do a deeper dive to make sure that this is exactly where we wanted to go if we decided on a no boundary option for a comprehensive school. The second option is to do a limited geographic feeder, which would basically be from the Lake Taylor Middle School program, whether it's a K-8 or a middle school program. In this case, again, we would still be oversubscribing other schools. But in this case, what we anticipate is that 1/3 of the anticipated 9th grade class would actually come from the limited geographic boundary, and then 2/3 of the seats would be open to choice. So you have a 1/3, 2/3 option. Again, allowing for diversity, allowing for the division-wide to come in. Now, this number can grow. I mean, if the anticipated long-term goal is to build a new building here in time, you can build it to how big or small you want to build it to. But right now, I'm just focusing on the capacity of the current facility you have because I don't know how long it's going to take you to get to a new building here. At this point, I don't. So with that being said, you've got a 1/3, 2/3 option then, still leaving a lot of choice. And what this also does is it allows students who live in a neighborhood to have a neighborhood high school in their backyard. That they're not forced to opt out of something when they have a high school right across the street from them. So I think that that's an advantage to this one.
Blended.
The next option just shows, and again, I don't have maps for all of these, but I'm going to show you another map here in a second. The next one you have is a programmatic feeder. In this case, what we were anticipating was that Southside STEM extending to a K-12 program of STEM that chooses into this building. Now, in this case, if 100% of those students choose the STEM program, and I'm going to just make an assumption, but whether that's worst or best case scenario, I don't even know what to call it. But that would mean 1/4 of the 9th grade class would be dedicated to students that are already in the program, and then 3/4 would be open to division-wide choice. So again, you leave a lot of seats for choice, but you've offered a curriculum that is a full K-12 curriculum in STEM to allow that to happen. And again, even if it's not STEM, if it's some other middle grades program, but geographically to do just this. The final option simply shows that just a combination of the two. And again, all of the same things apply. The only difference is the number of seats. In this case, we would anticipate about a 50-50. About half of the seats would be dedicated to program and geography, and then the other half to division-wide choice. Again, which limits some of that opportunity for diversification. And so on paper, this one can make some sense, obviously. This is a programmatic benefit of having a K-12 systemic education and a neighborhood backyard, but what it does is it limits the number of seats for division-wide choice. So you can see that they all have certainly benefits and challenges to them. And, but what I'm going to suggest is that the last three, you can move into division-wide choice out of all of those. The first one, if you started all choice, it would be more difficult to rechange a boundary, to go back and redo boundaries, to make it a feeder school in some way. So I think what the last three do for you is allow you an opportunity to opt into a full choice in time, if the program deems it appropriate. So I think that's one exit grant for you to do that. The first one would mean retracing and going back to figure out what the boundaries are, and then re-engage in a community that you once took away. So I think that's a challenge to it. Certainly can be done. So without talking about programs, those were the boundary options that we have, and on how we get this school to, and again, whether that's 300, 400, or 500, whatever the program goes to, all of these apply to that, to whatever the number is. Yes.
So I'm thrilled that we're talking about CTE, because we definitely need to do it. I know our board's all in favor of it, our community is in favor of it. It's long overdue, so now we're talking about it at the table, which is great. What's the timing of this? I know we're doing it pilot now at NTC for the Business and Information Technology Academy.
We're doing that at Lake Taylor High School, actually.
Okay, so we're doing that now.
And
then
so
what's
the
the timing?
fall, as Trace indicated here, we would then move from the pilot into the operationalizing of this school fall of it, this coming fall, the fall of 18.
Right,
And so that's our timeline for this.
and it would be for all 4 programs, starting with not populating the 9th grade with feeder, but with new, and the 9th and the 10th,
It
11th
depends
going
on
up.
which option is checked. And we did pull the information, and we have some of it here, roughly 500 ninth grade students currently.
Oh, at Lake Taylor?
Yes.
Okay. So the idea is that we could begin to fully implement all 4 programs of the CTE next year, or just the one?
3 of the 4 definitely. The 4th one, we're doing some work
Okay.
with the state on, but absolutely. And in that shared dual campus model with NTC serving the heavier trades area and Lake Taylor High School doing the academic and some of the technology pieces, but with blended faculty
Right.
to do this.
With a vision of one day having a building that would be a CTA
Right.
building on the Lake Taylor
Right.
property.
And again, you will see on one of the very first slide, or one of the early slides on the Lake Taylor piece, it talks about a shared governance model, a different governance model. I know there was some concern that we were stepping ahead of that governance model. The governance model can't set the boundaries for the schools. The board has to do that. And as soon as we navigate this, then we'll bring in those folks that are part of the governance team for the programmatic and the staffing and all of that. But we needed to get a nod from the board at the appropriate time that this is how we're going to make that building accessible for the CTE school.
So I'm sorry, you said the number for Lake Taylor today?
Roughly 500 ninth graders.
Thank you.
554 last year, so we're roughly 500 this year.
Ms. Basic,
Well,
Dr. Robinson.
No, my question was answered by, asked by Ms. Dole.
mine too, the transition
So,
time.
Yeah.
if you can walk me through this too. So, phasing in for the ninth graders, we would still have at Lake Taylor next year the specialty program that's currently there.
Well, see, that gets into the governance piece. You know, the specialty, that's a specialty school, which is the comprehensive CTE high school. So the specialty program of leadership in our JROTC is part of the conversation we have to have. I would envision JROTC still being a part of the school, but that's, again, what gets into that separation of the governance team and what they would be working toward in terms of that overall programming.
Okay. So for instance, the current, I know there's promotional activity going on currently for our high schools, which I believe our specialty program there is being promoted. So what is the communication going out currently?
There couldn't be any until we had a conversation with the
Right.
board about a direction.
Well, I guess that's my question.
Right.
Is that it's,
There's a lot of the conversation gets directed by this decision.
right.
Well, on the programmatic stuff and all that stuff, but really the availability of access, I mean, if it's half, if it's 1/3, if it's 2/3.
Right.
I mean, I think that the message stays the same about the programming and doing all that stuff.
Right.
And so that sits outside what I'm trying to get to, but it will focus our effort of where the message goes a lot.
Okay.
Because again, if we're oversubscribing buildings, it's like any sort of division-wide, when we look at magnet programs across the country, one of the things they do to target, diverse populations is that, they go into areas that they need, and they try to get more applications from that area,
Right.
and they really push marketing hard.
Right.
Kind of the same discussion here.
Yeah.
Whatever you guys are doing on the programmatic discussion, I don't know, but this one will help drive some of that conversation,
Okay.
definitely.
Okay, so we have it tight, in theory, before
Yeah.
applications are put out and
Yep. Yep.
things like that. Okay.
So I have a question.
Yes.
From the scenarios that you considered, we started off with imbalance in our students and utilization, CT, no CT. We
Right.
had 5 high schools, some were oversubscribed, some were undersubscribed.
Correct.
Did you look at how you would propose balancing the 5 high schools first, and then looking at the CTE program on top? Because it seems to me that
Good question.
what this is the CTE driving the balance, and you come up with a set of recommendations. But when you look at the high school attendance zones and the concepts that we use around
Sure.
whatever a neighborhood is, we know the existing boundaries that we have, are subject to all kinds of debate whether or not it's a neighborhood or not.
No question.
So if you were to look at recommendations around having balanced attendance with our high schools, and in consideration of the conversation, the board has had conversations around our specialty programs.
Sure.
So one of the things I'm sure that you hear in your committee meetings dealing with Booker T is the fact that we've had discussions as a board that the programmatic offerings at Lake Taylor and Booker T are at one level compared to the others.
Yes.
So we had some conversation around what do you do to strengthen what currently exists.
Sure.
On top of you having this, going through this analysis of what we say we want to add on top of that.
Sure.
So I just want to know if you were able to look at a balancing strategy first, and then with the program, the CT and the other programs added on top, do you think it would look any different? Or would
So-
you approach it differently?
I think it's, and actually, the short answer is no, we didn't approach it like that. But I can see exactly where you're going, and maybe part of the reason we need to have this first preliminary discussion is because of that. I think that the closest we come is having that small geographic feeder to start, to say that we've got this many seats available, but we can expand that based on balance of enrollment. But you're right, I think that, one of the reasons that Norview is unsubscribed is because, or oversubscribed right now, is because it has a really strong program draw, no question. And so the discussions around, I'm sorry?
And a good building.
And a good building, no question, yeah, no doubt. So I think that only helps. But I think in that discussion, that the program enhancements and the ability to implement the programs like at Booker T will be critical elements. What I don't know, though, is that I don't have any sort of kind of factual evidence, with the exception of, if Booker T was a good building along with that strong program, what is the comparison? I don't have that comparison. Norview is a good building with a good program, and so it's kind of an apples to, I don't know, not quite oranges, but tangerines maybe, discussion. So I think that in order to see some of that balance, what I was trying to do was trying to get to a school that would offer the opportunity for the diversification that we're really looking for. And so that's what our approach was on that boundary.
Right, but my follow-up is, I guess where I'm trying to get to is, when we talk about whether it's full choice or limited choice,
Yes.
if we have 5 high schools and 4 have strong programs
Right.
and 1 does not,
Right.
then when we are having this conversation around choice, it can potentially impact choice if we don't feel that each high school truly has a strong program.
So that comes back to me, not Tracy.
Oh, I know, I'm just.
Yeah.
I'm
So,
just for the-
you will
for the whole.
recall when we did the mini retreat with the board in January, and we talked about what we do to strengthen our specialty programs at our high schools. John Coleman is chairing the group, and remember, we did an update. He's chairing a group that's helping us look at all that, and the schools are represented. What will it take for that to be a very robust program, particularly at Booker T? They recently attended a conference that looks at magnet and specialty programs and brought back a lot of information that we are vetting to go through that. So the work is well underway to begin to strengthen that, including, I've said to the team, we posed the question at Booker T, is that still the specialty program that they would like to have?
Right.
Because we think this is an important time to ask that question, since it never fully matured. and to strengthen, we've talked before, that when the champion of the program retired and moved on, you didn't necessarily have that backfield. And so what would that look like? And that's the work that's going on in that group that John Coleman is leading. And we will be coming back to the board with those conversations and what that looks like.
Maybe the benefit of oversubscribing Booker T. Washington with more students, regardless of what the feeder they come into, is the exposure to, linked with that implementation, that maybe we'll keep and maintain a stronger population base to stay at Booker T, because I don't want Lake Taylor to be the default school just because it's closest, and so, but that only is done by what you say.
Right, but in the context of the discussion we had earlier,
Yep, yes, no doubt.
if you don't want to hear the history
Yep.
continue,
Yes.
then to me, how we put Booker T's program first, and then everything else is tied to that.
Yes.
Is one way that we move forward. But if we go down the path where we do everything else and then come back and talk about Booker T last, that's going to keep
Can't
us
be.
anchored in the very thing that you all said you want us released from.
Completely agree.
And that's my thing. Do we strengthen this before we transition?
Or
Well,
while
and-
we,
Or-
we'll have to do
or-
both
Yeah.
at the same
Yeah,
time.
and the first thing, and like I said, the first thing we do is we can help oversubscribe the building to get population there, to get them exposure to those programs, to make them populated too.
But if we do both at the same time, are we gonna, in terms of marketing, is the marketing piece gonna be?
They,
Robust.
I don't
Figure it out.
envision Booker T being a comprehensive CTE program that would have a focus that would compete against Lake Taylor High Schools. I think they would be separate and distinct options.
No, I understand that, but I'm just saying that in terms of people making choices.
right.
And the options, we certainly want it to look strong, but if we're doing it at the same time, are we gonna be able to market it as a strong school along with the
Yep.
CTE program?
We'd have to bolster the marketing effort, no doubt, to do both at the same time.
And that's part of the
Yeah.
conversation of
Yeah.
that.
But it raises the awareness of everything all at once, which I think is
That's
a good
right.
thing.
That's
Yeah.
right.
As long as we do it.
All right, awesome.
We are already doing it.
So I think part of all that discussion is what we do for follow-up here, is that the first thing that we do is that with, again, in the conversation of board direction, we need to go meet with the local agencies, so the local school. So the Camp Allen Sewell's Point, can we move on to do that? Fairlawn Poplar Halls would have to be a community discussion, specifically with those schools. St. Helena, same thing, and then obviously the Lake Taylor community around this transition. I think that we could include, again, and I would agree with this, that the idea, if Booker T. Washington is one discussion to have, we include that in the follow-up discussion. So I think that those are discussions that we have to do, but we have to do them before the end of the year. Now, typically, again, and I'm not suggesting you do this, typically you don't use me for those. You use me for the data, and you go communicate that with yourselves. So, and that's fine, but understand that we have the data to help support you to do those efforts in the next 8 weeks here, before the holidays. The next thing is that we're going to continue to meet with the steering committee. One of the things that we want to introduce to the committee is the results from the meeting. I'm going to give you a copy of that. And then most probably for me, looking forward, is the spring deliverable of a comprehensive facilities plan. To the point of we need to lay out a 5, 10, 15, and 20-year plan for the division. Now that we have, and this is a great transition to Mike, now that we have the condition piece, we are fully positioned now to do a comprehensive facilities master plan, and along with the efforts that you're making now with the city on developing a budget strategy, we have every piston now firing for a comprehensive facilities master plan. Now, what we intend to do in the spring is this, is that we intend to do a lot of internal work, get it in full dose, and then keep updating the steering committee in our steps in the spring. And we've asked them to continue with us. And then, but to give you a full condition, demographic, programmatic, and cost effort for the next 5, 10, and 15, and 20 years. We are, and I'm going to make the comparison really quick. In Virginia Beach, we did this 10 years ago. And they have an outline plan based on all of these things, because we had all these things. And this second effort that we're doing now with Virginia Beach is a lot easier exercise because we already have all of the pieces in place. Now we just have to base our update on cost conditions and some reprioritization based on some demographic shift. But basically the bones of that plan are in place for a 5, 10, and 15, and 20-year plan that is a smaller effort every time you go into it. So our goal in the spring is to do this for you. But again, part of that next steps is just that. And so we have a lot of discussion to do about that, but I want you to know that that's coming. And as much as how much we'll involve you, we'll see as we make these next couple board presentations to you before the end of the year.
And so if we get ready to transition to HBA, I want to thank them. You know, we had, in my opening comments, I thanked a lot of folks, but I wanted to thank them especially because the scope of their work grew during this process. We started with schools that from the plan that the district had in place and looking at what we knew about the conditions of schools at that point, and we picked the top 10 and asked them to look at them. Then we added a few more. Then we had the conversation about when do we begin investing a lot of money into maintenance projects for schools, and that's that 20-year threshold. And so we expanded the scope of the work to include all schools that were 20-plus years old. And so I want to say thank you to that team for accepting the expanded opportunity and for coming back with an extremely, extremely comprehensive master plan. Now, the numbers will give you pause, so everybody, you have water before you.
Yeah.
They won't surprise us.
It won't surprise you, but they're big, and so with that, I'll let
My
Tracy-
transition out is I'm going to thank you, and I'm going to move out of the way for Mike Ross to come in. Mike and I have had the pleasure of working together for almost a little over a decade now.
Yep.
I will tell you, and I don't say this because he's standing in front of me, I work with a lot of architects across this country, and there may not be a finer architect that understands education as well as this man. So I don't say that to bolster his reputation
So I
in
owe you
that
another
cat.
20,
You
huh?
owe me lunch now, but other than that, what he's gonna show you is a systems. We haven't considered programs in this, so I just want you to know that. But I'm gonna transition out and let Mike kind of take the stage.
Before you transition, Dr. Boone, so on your next step
Yes, sir.
recommendations,
Yes.
so there were 2 recommendations that you are encouraging the board to make a decision on.
Yes, sir.
And they were Camp Allen, Souls Point,
Yes.
and the feeder pattern change at St. Helena.
Yes, sir.
So when you talk about the future meetings, that's around decisions that the board would potentially make that would take effect this upcoming school year.
Yes, sir.
Then the conversation around Fairlawn Harbor Halls and Lake Taylor is a different type of community conversation where it's still feedback.
Yes.
So I just want to make sure that we're clear that that's what you're really suggesting in terms of next steps.
Great clarification on that.
Okay.
That's exactly
That-
what we're after.
Right, some more feedback, and then we'll come back with a clear set of recommendations like a discussion we had today for those initial 2.
And you're gonna,
That discussion happened with us, January, after you've had it.
I would hope it'd be their
Well-
December introduction. It could be
December.
January though.
I'm now confused.
okay, what's the,
Are we talking Lake Taylor Middle School, or are you talking Lake Taylor High School
Both.
slash? Okay, so you're not ready to, because,
We're not ready for you. There's some more pieces, as Tracy was saying, we need to vet around the Lake Taylor Middle transition to a K-8 that impacts Poplar Hall and Fairlawn.
right,
We wanted to hear your thoughts tonight on those 4 options for Lake Taylor High School. Now, we can do some more work around that to bring that to you as a clear recommendation.
when would that occur?
so we have gender play, we have to take all the feedback that we've gotten from this meeting and map those out. Because first we have to be able to map out the meeting schedule based upon whatever is going to be the will of the board around Camp Allen, Souls Point, and the St. Helena option, which we know may require certain meetings and public hearings and so forth. And then we also have to map out, based upon the feedback we've gotten from today, what our continuing discussion would be around Fairlawn Parvers Hall and the CTE options.
Well, and again, those are, then
They connect.
the Fairlawn, Poplar Hall, Lake Taylor Middle School, that's a 2-year plan, that's 19.
Right.
We're
Right.
looking at St. Helena, Camp Allen, Sewell's Point
The
for
next fall.
2018.
Yes.
Correct,
And the CTE school,
correct.
2018.
That's correct.
So we need to ramp up the last 2 very
Right,
quickly.
that's,
Okay.
That'd be
Just
With the
making sure it's
CTE
clear.
right, with the CTE carrying that initially, but since we were talking about a 2-year phase-in for,
And including, and not to leave it out, but including what happens with Booker T.
Absolutely.
That possible.
right, the specialty program, we got all of that.
Right, okay.
And all of this needs to happen in a timely way to impact our funding formula discussion / budget.
And we have used some of this in the context of the conversations we're already having around.
So that we're not bumping up against a May date or an
Right.
April 1 date,
Well-
which is one of my concerns, is that we don't want to do that and then have still the community left to wonder, what is it going to cost, when is it going to happen, and who
Well,
needs to support it, and
The short story on the capital piece is that I've already briefed the city manager and his team when we had a meeting about the revenue sharing, of what the landscape looks like financially in terms of what we would need annually for maintenance of our current facilities and what it would take to replace all of our current facilities. So that, they already have those numbers, and we've talked about, they, in the model that they shared with the joint meeting, putting aside 0.25% in a lockbox every year until that builds to a certain point and how much that could leverage. And so now that we've shared these numbers with them, that percentage is not gonna get us too far.
because what we did say we
Call
wanted to.
EMS.
Because what we did say we wanted to have was educational planning as described today, putting the CTE on the table, looking at the facility utilization,
Which we're getting ready to have.
exactly, which would encompass the Maury facility, the CTE build, the Booker T needs, and all the
And
other
all
down
the
the
other
line
needs.
that you're gonna bring up, which I understand. But we wanted to wrap all that up in a bow so that we next spring, or even earlier, we're saying to the community, this is what we're gonna do and this is what
Well,
it's
I
gonna
think you'll
cost.
see it very clearly once we go through this presentation on the HBA piece, on the facility condition.
I'm just concerned that we time this out, that we're efficient, and that we're not bumping up against a budget deadline, that
Oh,
then
no.
we're going into the
Like I
next year.
said, we're already talking about the capital needs as part of the background that we've done with the city manager's team, the smaller group work that Ms. Ingram and Ms. Tao have done with the city's folks. So we're putting this on the table
Okay.
with that. So there's no surprise about these numbers. And we're using that to inform the model that will eventually come to the board, hopefully. Which that has a February window, just so you'll know where the revenue sharing model is on a February window.
Okay.
I'm just gonna get out of the
Okay.
camera.
Welcome.
Good afternoon.
Floor is yours.
Good afternoon, Dr. Boone, Mr. Jordan, and the school board members. And Dr. Boone, thank you for that introduction about the scope. That'll save me a little bit of time. So I'm going to start with the why. You've got some suggested reading in front of you, and I thought I would use that as a cue. Why do we do facility condition assessments? And it's really two primary reasons. It's for the planning piece, which you've already talked about a little bit, and it's for stewardship. So for the planning piece, I think y'all have been working with Tracy long enough to see his picture of the four-legged stool. He talks about facilities planning and how you've got conditions, and you've got costs, and you've got demographics and enrollments. All those things are data sets that you use to inform your decision-making process about what your long-range planning should look like, when you should replace facilities, and what the ultimate disposition facilities are. So I'm not going to talk too much about that. My presentation focuses more on the stewardship side of your facilities, or in other words, taking care of what you have. So let me get started on the slides here. So as Dr. Boone mentioned, the scope grew to ultimately looking at almost all of your schools in terms of a condition assessment. We didn't do Maury, we didn't do Madison because of an assumption that they were already in high need. And we also didn't look at your newer schools. So we looked at that group of about 47 or 48 schools. So as we think about facilities, as a school board, you own and operate over 50 school buildings, over 5 million square feet. And in the context of planning and also the context of stewardship, it's very important to have a really good understanding of the condition of your facilities so that you can both plan for replacements and also take care of what you have, because having good facilities is paramount to being able to deliver the quality education program that you want to deliver. So as we look at the conditions of buildings and do our assessments, there's a general assumption that buildings last for a long time. They last for 60, 80 to 100 years. But the systems and components in those buildings don't last for that long. Think of your house. You replace the HVAC system every 20, 25 years. You probably replace your roof every 20, 25 years. School buildings are the same way. They're made up of subsystems which have to be replaced on shorter cycles than the lifespan of a building. So we call that capital renewals. That's taking care of your buildings over time. So as we look at these various systems, things like structure, floor structure, wall structure, roof structures, those are the things that tend to last 80 to 100 years. When we look at other systems like HVAC systems and roofing systems, they tend to last 25 to 30 years. Other systems like carpets and paint and technology have a much shorter lifespan, 5 to 10 years sometimes. So we take all those factors into consideration when we look at the condition of a building. Okay. So this graphic that I just put in front of you, it's the story of the condition of a building over time. When we think about building condition, we simplistically define the condition of a building as between 0 and 1. 0 is a brand new building. 1 is a building where all systems are totally obsolete. You don't have any of those, but we have buildings that are starting to approach that point where they have some serious needs. So as you look at this graph, what happens over time is your brand new building that starts at 0, the facility condition index starts to grow. It starts to get up into the 0.3s and 0.4s. And right around that 20 to 25 year time frame, you start replacing some of these systems that have a 25 to 30 year life, like the mechanical systems, like the roofs. So your FCI goes down. But then it starts going back up again because there's other systems that you probably didn't replace because they have longer lifespans. So you get to that range of 35 to 40 years out, and you start getting to a point where the building has a lot of systems that are nearing the end of its useful life and a lot of other systems that are maybe halfway or 2/3 of the way through their useful life. And it's very cyclic. And along about that 35, 40-year time frame is when most school divisions think about either a major modernization, and that's replacing all the systems that can be replaced in a building, or a replacement. If you don't do one of those two things, that FCI line continues tracking upwards towards that 0.65 and higher line. And that's what's happening to a number of your facilities that we looked at over the course of the last 4 to 5 months. So, once again, a system condition index scores a system, like an HVAC or a roof or a floor or a ceiling. And we're going to give every one of those systems a score between 0 and 1, 0 being brand new, 1 being obsolete. So if we scored it, say, a 5, that means it's halfway through its useful life. We scored it a 0.75, that means it's 3/4 of the way its useful life. It's got 25% of its useful life left. So it's pretty simple. We think of the building as the same way. We roll up these system condition index numbers into a summation that's weighted by the relative value of each of these systems, and we call that an importance factor. So for instance, the parts of the building that cost more to replace have a higher importance factor. For instance, an HVAC system, the value of that in the context of its whole building is probably 15 to 20%. So that's much more important than the value of, say, replacing the doors, which might be 1 or 2%, or replacing the carpet, which is probably less than 1%. So We take the SCI value, or the score, and we multiply it times the importance factor, so that gives what we call a weighted system condition index. And then when we add all of these up, we get the facility condition index for the school building, which is the sum of all those weighted components. Okay? So I'm going to give you an example of how that works. Slide advance was a little bit sluggish. Okay, there it goes. All right. So the process was, and I want to take an opportunity to introduce my teammates, Jack Haston, architect with HBA. I think y'all know him pretty well. He's worked on a number of schools in Norfolk, Crossroads, and Maury and Granby. And also John Hazlett was my other teammate in doing these assessments. I know you know him well. So the three of us would spend anywhere from an hour and a half at elementary school to probably about 3 hours at a high school, walking around looking at all of these various systems. And you can see on the left-hand side of this list, these are the systems that we're scoring. So you can see structural floor, structural wall, structural roof, all those various systems. The systems at the top of the list are the systems that tend to last that 80 to 100 years. The systems in the middle and near the bottom are systems that have shorter lifespans. So we would walk through the building, survey it. We were usually accompanied, or always accompanied, by one of Steve Smith's senior HVAC staff and also the head custodian. So we were getting their input into the condition of these things along with our visual observations. So you can see we would each score these systems separately, and then we would average our scores. And I was using the scale of between 0 and 1. What we did in our scoring is we used a scale of 0 to 10, because that was a little bit easier to keep track of in our heads. And then I've divided it by 10 in our math here. So when you see that column where it says average SCIs, which is the one that has all the color in it, structural floor system was a 0.5, which makes sense because it's about a 50-year-old building, 1967. So all those structural systems were 0.5. The roofing system was a 0.7 something, so that meant it was about 2/3 of its way through its useful life. And the other wrinkle to this is that we see a lot of buildings that have systems that have been incrementally replaced, and Lake Taylor is a good example of that, because some of the roofs have been replaced recently. We're doing some more this summer, and there's other parts of the building that the roofs are still in pretty bad shape. So this 0.76 actually predates the roof repairs that are happening right now. So you go right down that list, and you can see the scores that each one of these systems received. Window systems received a 1. So in our opinion, they had reached the end of their useful life, so forth and so on. So the next column over, the importance factor weight, that's those importance factors that I talked about. So each one of those is a part of the sum of 1. So for instance, structural floors is 6%, structural walls was 1%, structural roofs was 0.05%. So all of those numbers add up to 1. And that's what we multiply the system condition index by to end up with that weighted SCI. And then when we add all those weighted SCIs up, we end up with a facility condition index for the school, which in this case was 0.68.
96, right, 0.69.
Yeah. 0.6896. Yeah. So I used an example of a school that has a lot of systems that are reaching the end of its useful life. I'm going to show you another page on the next page, which is a relatively young school. It was built in 2007, so it's only 10 years old. And as you would expect, it has very little need in terms of building systems or component replacements. So that facility condition index is what we use to compare schools to each other in terms of relative need for replacing building systems and components. The other thing that we can use this tool for is we can start to project priority budgeting for capital renewals. And that's what the whole right-hand side of this sheet is. So that column that's in yellow, we call that priority 1. And what that is that's every system that has a SCI greater than 0.9. And what that means is it's got 10% or less of its useful life left. So you can see in the average SCI columns, all the numbers in that column that are 0.9 or higher are colored yellow. And then you track that over to the priority 1 column. We utilize average system replacement square foot cost based on Department of Education construction cost standards to generate what it would cost to replace these systems. So that number you see there, for instance, for the roof, we're multiplying the square footage of the building by that $3.81. And that's giving us that, I'm sorry, that's for doors. That's giving us the $900,000 number.
Right.
I printed these so small I can barely see them myself. So a lot of big numbers and small rectangles. So each one of those numbers in the yellow column is the square footage of the building multiplied by the cost to replace that system. And those, once again, are all systems that are 0.9 or higher, have 10% or less of their useful life left. So when you total all that up for Lake Taylor High School, it's over a little bit over $24 million. And that's just for priority 1. Priority 2 is systems that have an SCI between 0.8 and 0.9, so they have between 10 and 20% of their useful life left. Priority 3 is between 0.7 and 0.8, so they have between 20 and 30% of their useful life left, so forth and so on. So each one of these generates a number and a priority. And in general, the way we like to think of this is that priority 1 needs are things that they should be replaced in the next 3 to 5 years. Priority 2 needs are probably in the 5 to 10 year window. Priority 3 needs are probably in the 10 to 15 year window. And priority 4 needs are in the 15 to 20 year window. So all told, over the next 20 to 25 years at Lake Taylor High School, you need to spend about $48, $49 million, if I'm reading that correctly.
Could you repeat what the priority 1 timeframe?
Priority 1 is from now until about 4 to 5 years out.
Okay, thank you.
It's got less than 10% of its useful life left, and most of these systems have a 30 to 35 year life. So for Lake Taylor High School, the projected need was almost $49 million. And that's just replacing the systems within the building that are going to wear out over the next 20 years. That's not $49 million you need to spend tomorrow, but it's over the next 20 to 25 years. But there's an immediate need of 20-some million, almost $24 million for this particular school. Okay? And that's spending no money to prove the quality of education for the learning environment. That's just to replace components and systems as they wear out. So in your full report that you all have a copy of, there's one of these sheets for every school represented here. So there's 50-some sheets. Each school is scored. On the very next slide, you'll see an example of a school that's only 10 years old. And as you can imagine, it needs very little work done. In fact, the only thing we're projecting that needs to happen in the next 10 years or so is painting the walls. It's only 10 years old. So it's somewhat intuitive. So how did the schools do in general? I'm going to give you some general observations first, and then we'll look a little bit detailed at the chart. Get to it. Okay. So, in general, The school facilities and construction industry considers that an FCI greater than .65, the school is generally in poor condition, and it may be impacting the delivery of your educational program. Schools that are considered fair are in that .4 to .65 range, and then schools that are good are considered to be .4 or less. So when we look at the overall tabulation of your schools, 3 of your 5 high schools, and that's including Maury, had an FCI greater than .65. 1 of your high schools had an FCI less than .4. 3 of your middle schools had an FCI greater than .65, and a 4th middle school is very close at .64. So if you don't do anything to it over the next year, it'll be at .65 by next year because things age. And once again, 1 of your middle schools is fairly new. 21 of 36 elementary schools have an FCI greater than .65. 7 of them are in fairly good shape, .4. So I don't think this is surprising news, but it's a document that you can use as a planning tool. So the other interesting thing that we like to put into these reports is what we call an age-based analysis. And there's some data out there that's published by the U.S. Department of Education National Center for Education Statistics. It talks about relative age of schools across the country, okay? So across the country, the natural average age of all schools is about 42 years old. And in the southeast region, the average age is about 37 years old. So the average age of your 6 high schools currently is about 57 years old. So that's part of the reason for the high FCIs. The schools are old. We all know that. The average age of your middle schools is 49 years old. The average age of your elementary schools is 46 years old. So if you tabulate that all up, the average age of your 50 schools, or approximately 50 schools, is about 48 years old. So compared to the national statistics, you're 5 or 6 years older. Compared to the regional, the southeast, you're about 10 to 11 years older in terms of replacing your schools as they wear out.
I have a quick question
Sure.
concerning that. When you're talking about the high schools, and you're talking about the age of the high schools, because Granby was completely renovated several years ago. Is that still considered age when it was first built, or?
We tend to think of that as the age when it was first built because
Okay.
you didn't replace those structural systems.
Right.
So a third of the building is still almost 100 years old.
Okay.
Same thing with Maury.
Well, I
Third-
didn't want to talk about it.
All right. So what I want to do now is I want to talk about how we use this tool for capital renewal budgeting, and I've talked about that a little bit, and I've thrown some terms out there. And I just want to reiterate what I'm meaning when I'm talking about these terms. So when we talk about a capital replacement, that's replacing an older facility with a new facility of equal size. And in the chart I'm going to show you in a few minutes, it tabulates your current capital replacement value of all your buildings. The second term we use is capital renewal. And capital renewals is replacing those shorter-term systems and components in the building that tend to wear out over 30 to 50 years. So the capital renewal value of a building is less than the capital replacement value of a building because you would never replace structural systems. You would replace the building before you would replace structural systems. So typically the current capital renewal value of the building is about 60 to 65% of the replacement value, just as a rule of thumb. So a third of the building systems you would not replace. They tend to last 80 to 100 years. Okay? And when we talk about current capital renewal value, in our business, we generally assume that if you spent that amount of money, you're calling it, that's what we call a full renovation. You're replacing every system in the building that could be replaced. And you're spending about 2/3 of the cost of building a new building to do that. So the other piece of information I want to share with you has to do with how the industry and owners in general tend to plan for capital renewal funding. And I pulled an excerpt from a report called Committing to the Cost of Ownership, Maintenance, and Repair of Public Buildings, which was published about 15 or 20 years ago, but it's still relevant. It was a government-funded research project that was basically initiated because of concern about the aging infrastructure of the country. And what they found was that public agencies like municipalities and school divisions that were keeping up with their capital renewals were spending about 2 to 4% of their current capital renewal value annually to take care of their buildings. So once again, that's 2/3 of the cost of a replacement, spending 2% of that every year to take care of your building, to put that in context. And I've got some math I'm going to show you on the very next slide. So in your report, you're not going to be able to read the slide, but it's page 8. You can, nice long chart here if you want to pull that out. So what that is a listing of all the schools that we assessed, and we've grouped them by high school, middle school, and elementary school. We show their gross building areas. In the next column, we show the age of the original building in the next column, and then we show the facility condition index scores. Now, for this particular document, we have sorted by FCI, so high FCIs to the top, low FCIs to the bottom, by grade group level. So we separated high schools, middle schools, and elementaries. So you can see which schools kind of bubble to the top in terms of having the most need. And once again, I don't think this is any surprise to you. So the next column over, the purple column with the header replace, that's the current capital replacement value of a particular school. If you were to build it again in $2018. Now, we'll add that this also includes what we call soft cost. And soft costs are things like design fees, contingency, furnishings. So this is more than just the cost of construction. This is total replacement building value if it burned to the ground and you had to replace it. The thing that this does not account for is program accommodation for modern educational programs. If the school needed to be larger than the school that's replacing, it would be more than this value because you would have more square footage. So as you think about modern classrooms and the active learning environments we're trying to facilitate, elementaries, middle, and high schools are tending to have more area per student now than they did when we built these buildings 30, 40, 50, 60 years ago. So you don't want to spend too much time dwelling on these current capital replacement values because most of these schools, if you were to replace it, you would build a larger school unless the enrollment was going down. If the enrollment was going down, you could right-size the school and possibly build a smaller school. But we use this number in some of our calculations, so that's why it's important to us. The next column over is the renovate column, and that's the current capital renewal value. So once again, that's the cost of replacing all the systems in a building that could be replaced short of replacing the structure. So once again, using Lake Taylor High School as an example, to replace the total building, we're looking at $79 million. But to replace all its building system components and leave the structure, it's $54 million. And of that $54 million, if you run across the priority 1, 2, 3, we're telling you that you need to spend about $49 million of that in the next 20 to 25 years. So it's got a lot of need.
Half of that in the first 5 years.
So each grouping of schools, you can see Lake Tahoe High School, and they are sorted in order of high FCI to low FCI. So Lake Taylor and Booker T are running kind of neck to neck. Now, we'll point out that this Booker T FCI number does not take into consideration some of the improvements that occurred over the summer. So that number will go down if it's reassessed. Isaiah Garden Middle School was at the top of our list in terms of need for middle schools. Rosemont Forest, or Rosemont Middle was a close second. Lake Taylor Middle was kind of up there too, as was Northside. Northside would have probably had a higher score if you hadn't just recently replaced the roof within the last couple of years. So that's the other unique thing about this system. It's a live analysis. Every time you go into a building and upgrade a system, it changes the FCI score because you've got a new roof or a new set of windows or a new HVAC system, which lowers the score. So as you do these improvements, the schools tend to move around on this chart in terms of their relative condition. So if you look at the elementary schools, you can see that Larimore and Calcott and Willard and PB Young and Ingleside and Jaycox were all near the top. And once again, I don't think that's a big surprise to anybody. But it's a pretty fair assessment of the relative condition of things. And once again, this has value in two ways. It has value in terms of planning because it allows you to factor this into the mix when you think about disposition of schools and you start thinking about enrollments and where you might take schools offline or where you might, in large schools, you need to factor in what the condition is of these as you think about those moves you're going to make to affect other stresses like enrollment and educational program.
Quick question.
Yes.
Red, black, blue, it said definition below.
Okay.
Where am I missing that?
It's on
And this is actually a little bit interesting because it has to do with perception versus reality. When we started, as Dr. Boone mentioned, when we started this process, we started with what was perceived as the 15 or 16
Okay.
schools with the most need.
Yeah,
We called those category 1.
okay.
So you can see that most of them were near the top, but it wasn't the absolute 16 schools that had the most need in the final analysis.
Gotcha.
The category 2 schools were all other schools that were not in category 1 and older than 21 years, and the category 3 schools, and there weren't too many of those, there were only a half dozen of those, were schools that were 20 years old or less.
Thank you.
All right, so I want to come back to that capital renewal budgeting piece. I talked about current capital renewal value for each building. Once again, that's the yellow column. So if you add all those numbers up, down to about 2/3 of the way to the bottom of that list, you see that the current capital renewal value of all your school buildings is a little bit over $800 million. So what that tells us is that you should be spending or budgeting about $16 million a year to take care of the buildings that you have, just to maintain them in their current condition.
This is actually very good information.
Yes, that's a big number.
Just to maintain their.
Just to maintain them in their relatively high FCI condition. If you want to reduce the facility condition index of the school system as a whole, you would need to spend more money to catch up. And what I mean by catching up is if you look at priority 1, the total, $125 million, that's more than you would expect to spend over the first 5 years if you were spending $16 million a year. But what's happened is because you're not spending that amount of money every year, you're getting this condition called deferred maintenance. So things are getting pushed back, systems are being made to last longer than they really should, and you created this backlog of deferred maintenance. So it's not just a matter of spending a certain amount of money, you've got a little catching up to do also.
How many buildings is this?
How many buildings?
Yes, on this sheet right here.
I believe it's about 47 or 48 buildings. Once again, it didn't include Maury, and it didn't include Madison, and it didn't include Crossroads and the 5 new schools.
Gotcha.
You shouldn't need to spend any money on your new schools for about 20, 25 years, so we don't factor those in.
So I have a question. So if Lake Taylor's FCI is as high as it is, and how does that play into, and Dr. Boone, this might be for you, how is that playing a role in the location of our CTE program?
I'll go back to, that question did come up before. Those were decisions made prior to my returning to the district.
Right.
So,
But the idea was that we were going to build a new building in place of the current Lake Taylor.
and they have land.
Right, because the building
And the
wasn't great, so we could do something different with it and it had the land underneath.
And the
And that was the
access,
previous conversation,
and,
if I recall
and the previous
correctly.
vote.
Right.
And the access to the interstate and those
Exactly.
things that allow us to access the various.
Right. So, but I'm asking, in this current decision-making process, what role is that going to play?
The
So-
facility condition index?
Yeah.
So we have to get through this presentation, and as we talked about earlier, there's gonna be some conversations we have to have around how we strategize moving forward, but there's been no, we're just getting this today. So,
Yeah.
you know, it just is what it is at this point.
Right, but I think from the folks who came to visit the school in Worcester and the conversations I had had about it, they knew that the condition, the age of the school, and that it had some significant condition issues. So I believe that was a driver in the original decisions also.
Well, as Ms. Doyle said, and as Dr. Robinson said, that's why the concept was the new construction.
Exactly.
Dr. Robinson?
Right.
Well, just a historical perspective, when we got the estimate what it would cost to renovate versus replace Lake Taylor High School, it was about a $500,000 difference we got from the architect. So then the decision to move forward was to seek to replace the high school.
And these numbers kind of bear that out, because if you're going to spend $49 million just to
Okay.
replace the components and systems, you're going to spend more money to modernize the building to accommodate the change in the educational program. So you probably are at a break-even point between what you would spend on a modernization versus what you'd spend on a replacement. That was a good question.
Yeah, the numbers bear out exactly to that point.
Yeah. So the very next page is the same chart, but it's sorted by absolute facility condition indexed and not grouped by grade level. So it shows a little bit different picture. It shows that the greatest need is at the elementary school level. If you look at the system globally,
What's in the book?
page 9
Yeah,
that I'm looking
But
at.
it's, yeah, it's on the screen also. It's the one that shows Ocean Air Elementary in the top block.
It's page 9 in your big report. It's actually not in the slideshow.
Oh, I thought the one that
I'm
started
sorry.
with Ocean Air
I
was
should have
the one
said
you.
that. Yeah.
You have it. That's-
Only page 8 was in the slideshow. Page 9 is the same data sorted differently. It's sorted by pure FCI and not by grade group level.
And that's where we get to the conversation we had earlier about the Poplar Halls condition.
Exactly. So you would take that off the table and you'd reduce your expenses,
Right.
et cetera, et cetera. Same with Madison, which I know Madison's not here, but you took it out already.
So if you want to save big dollars in capital renewals, those schools at the top are a good place to look.
Right.
It's not an absolute, it's another data set to consider when you're considering planning strategies as a whole.
And you also see the condition piece as it relates to Larimore, and that was something, again, that we've been talking about a while.
But you said Willard.
And, you know, we each say we're surprised certain schools are high up on the list of where they are. And that speaks volumes to how our buildings are maintained by our custodians particularly, and then our facility staff. They make them look good even though they're a little tired.
Yeah, it shouldn't go without saying that your custodial staffs are doing a wonderful job of maintaining these buildings in the condition that they're in. And also your teachers are doing a magnificent job in teaching in some of these facilities that have critical facility needs.
Count the raindrops.
So to summarize that data, our recommendation is that you need to budget about $16 million a year at a minimum just to stay current with your capital renewal needs. And that you need to probably accelerate that over the next 4 or 5 years if you want to do a little catch-up, tune of about 124, 125 million. And then as part of your long-range strategic master plan, you need to think about this $500 million number and how that plays into the overall strategy replacements. Because if you replace a building at 100% of its cost, you do save that 60 to 65 or 70% of capital renewal cost. For 20 to 25 years, you don't have to spend any more money on it. But it should factor into your planning.
Let me ask you, if I could, let me ask you a question about Willoughby. We have pre-K there. Are we fully utilizing the building today at Willoughby? We know?
Dr. Boone.
Sorry, are we fully utilizing the building at Willoughby right now?
No, we have about 10 classrooms
Right.
of pre-K in there.
So are we taking into account the expense of keeping that building open
We are.
as it relates to this?
Not,
Well-
the study is one thing. That gets to that point of programmatic utilization and what we have. You'll recall the reason we kept Willoughby as a pre-K was because if we closed it, we wouldn't have pre-K services on that end of the city. And that's an area, when you look at the Ocean View enrollment, that we're having a lot of young families and a lot of pre-K needs and growth that would be in that area. The building is challenged and it's in a challenged location.
Yeah. Because I look at its index and it's very high.
Oh, yeah.
But that goes to your point of building utilization. What do you look at first?
Right.
As one data point.
It's one data point.
Right.
But that the schools that are at the top of this list are good candidates for either replacement or taking offline. So in terms of recommendations, and just pretty much what we talked about, you should use this condition data assessment tool to inform your decision-making process as part of the long-range master planning, and I'm sure Tracy will factor all these things into his planning process and his recommendations that he makes to you. The second point is to use this data to assist and prioritize in planning for future capital renewal projects. For instance, as part of your master plan strategy, if you realize you're going to decommission a school in 10 years, you probably don't want to replace the roof or replace the windows. Let's spend that money on somewhere else and let's try to make it last. So those types of short-term decisions need to be made in terms of your long-term planning strategy. And then the last recommendation is just to encourage you to work towards improving your funding allocations for capital renewal projects so you can catch up and improve the quality of your conditions of your schools.
And I think one of the most significant figures in here is the amount that's needed annually to prevent us from getting into a deferred maintenance window. And
We're already there.
well, we're deeply there. Yeah, we're deep
Getting
there.
further into it.
Right, getting further into it, and so that's about $16 million a year. So, of course, you know, you make adjustments around schools, you do certain things, and that compares with what had been $3 million annually, and the last couple of years has been $2 million. So,
Yeah, that's why you've got a big number over the next 5 years.
All right, well, we thank you. This is excellent work and a lot for us to digest.
sobering.
Dr. Boone, anything else you want
No,
to add at this point?
Again, kind of sobering, and I know, one of the things I appreciate in the conversation with them is discussing, what do we want from this presentation, from this study? And I said, the facts. We wanted to know what the facts are, because we often hear, well, tell us what you need, or how do we know that that's the case? Well, now we've done our buildings, and here's the data. So that's why we opted to expand the process, the study, to include so many more schools so that we have a full picture. So,
Any other additional questions on this portion, Dr. Reverend Haywood?
So I would imagine that a school with a very high FCI score would also be a school that would need to be looked at carefully in terms of safety issues for students. Would that be correct?
I'm sorry, could you repeat the first part of that? I was,
So a school with a very high FCI
yes.
would be also a school that we would need to look at carefully in terms of safety issues for students. Would that be correct?
Yeah,
Hold it to the next
safety,
budget cycle.
environmental. And I heard several stories today about
As long as that's
leaking
safe,
roofs.
that's good.
That leads to other bad things.
It's great to see this information like this. It's very informative and shocking.
All right, so we thank you again. Dr. Boone, any further comments right now on the academic planning, educational planning / facilities presentations?
well, I appreciate tonight's questions and dialogue and conversation around what's been shared. Leaving here hopefully with a shared understanding of what some next steps are, what are some things we're going to bring back to you, and how quickly we're doing that, and what's going to be the ongoing work around this. Certainly, the questions, the comments give us the information that we need when we go back to the planning table and we do tweaks or move on in other areas, so we can move forward. But I'm appreciative to Tracy Richter and Cooperative Strategies and Lee HBA, our own team members who've been a part of us getting to where we are now, along with the community task force members.
So I think it's fair to say we have a good set of professional data and recommendations for us to consider. Going back to our discussion earlier, I mean, first thing starts with us as a governance team to look at what decisions we make based upon the recommendations that we have, and then we can factor in how we go forward with all the other conversations that we know center around that. But for right now, if there's no additional questions on this piece, I know we have, we received an update. I like to recommend we just receive that as a written report and prepared to move into our closed session unless there's, yes, sir.
Just one note, you do also have a copy of this report in your flash drive.
Yes, there's
Yeah,
a
we did
flash
provide a
drive
flash drive, so
at each table. Thank you so much.
Very much.
Very much. That was great.
So,
And I guess I would say, I'm going to provide the same copy of this bound copy to the city manager. And then in the agenda planning tomorrow, we can talk about what we package for the joint meeting.
Right, and so the joint meeting is early December, right?
that's
That's
correct.
where we're sharing
The
basically all that
Wednesday.
we've heard.
Well, I think we have to figure out,
How are we going to
What
format
are-
and
yeah.
Right,
present.
exactly. That's the idea, sharing this content in some fashion.
right, some fashion.
Right, okay.
All right, so,
Okay.
do I have a motion for us to enter into closed session?
I move that we enter into closed session.
Do I have a second?
Personnel matter.
Second?
Yes.
Yeah. I'm sorry, well, would I have Mr. Butts share the motion?
Move that the members of the school board, the superintendent, and council go into a closed session for the purposes which are set on subsection A of section 2.2-3711 of the Freedom of Virginia Information Act as amended for A, discussion or consideration of prospective candidates for employment, assignment, appointment, promotion, performance, demotion, salaries, disciplining, or resignation of specific officers, appointees, or employees of the Norfolk Public Schools, including consideration of the personnel docket of this date pursuant to subsection 1 of the above cited code section. Consultation with counsel, legal counsel, and briefings by staff members, consultants, or
Mr. Butt,
attorneys
excuse-
pertaining.
Mr. Butt, excuse me for a minute. We're trying to get the motion. Thank you.
Pertaining to actual and probable litigation or other specific legal matters requiring the provision of legal advice by counsel. The substance of this section of the motion refers to advice of counsel regarding legal issues related to the personal actions identified above pursuant to subsections 7 and 8 of the above cited code section. Ms. Basine?
Aye.
Ms. Doyle?
Aye.
Dr. Gabriel?
Aye.
Reverend Hayward?
Aye.
Dr. Robinson?
Aye.
Mr. Jordan?
Aye. So it's 7:05, let's convene at 7:10. Me too.